Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Naruto was entrusted with a legendary gift. When Naruto is given a gift considered legendary even in a world where walking on water is a daily occurrence for some, will it lead him on a path towards peace, or will the consequences of said gift leave a hole in his heart too large to fill? Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel, and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard. Chapter 40, Earth 7. Make sure your chakra flow is as even as possible. Tsunade looked over Naruto's shoulder with scrutinizing eyes as she watched his green glowing palm pass slowly over the top of the small unconscious fish laid out in front of him. It was lying atop a scroll inscribed with many complex kanji designed to aid fledgling medic nin in spreading their medical chakra out evenly across the fish's whole body. The animal itself was pumped with many chemicals designed to simulate a near-death state that the training medic had to bring the creature out of. Good enough, I suppose. Tsunade was glad Naruto was facing away from her. She didn't want him to see her face. She was sure it showed her amazement that he had progressed so rapidly. Not only was the boy's chakra control practically unheard of, especially with the reserves the blonde seemed to have, but he had an unbelievable learning curve. She glanced over to the green-haired girl next to him, her hand flickering with faint green chakra as her scrunched-up face showed her frustrations. You can't have your chakra so erratic as it leaves your body, then you won't be able to control it at all once it is in the patient. The green-haired girl's response was a non-committal grunt as she continued to focus on smoothing out the flow of medicinal chakra through her hand. Tsunade just sighed in amusement. The mystical palm technique was one every medic had to learn. It was the crutch of the profession. It was a simultaneous diagnostic technique and a method to alter the qualities of one's chakra to better suit the patient's. Fo threw her hands up in the air in frustration as she glared at the now smoldering fish sitting before her, most certainly dead from the way a good chunk of its scales had melted away. Tsunade furrowed her brow as she looked at the charred remains of the fish, the frown creasing her forehead as she peered over the girl's shoulder. What am I doing wrong? Tsunade simply hummed an absent answer as she continued to observe the fish with the trained eye of a medic. It wasn't the first fish Fo had burned out, but Tsunade had thought that the first time was just some strange fluke. In honesty, the woman wasn't entirely sure why this kept happening. The girl had shown more than enough aptitude for medical training and her control was way above average. Even then, she had never actually seen a case of the mystic palm technique doing something like this. It was a simply tool to alter one's chakra to suit the needs of the situation. Of course, that only made her frown deepen. It pointed to the fact that Fo's chakra was inherently corrosive. So, when were you going to tell me you were a Jinchuriki? The question was so out of the blue Fo couldn't help but freeze suddenly, her orange eyes going wide in shock. Tsunade on the other hand blinked in surprise when she noticed Naruto do something similar out of the corner of her eye. That was interesting. What? Fo's attention was now firmly away from the charred remains of her patient, and now solely on the slug princess, doing her best to school her face and hide her shock. Puffed, who do you think you are talking to? There are only 9 people in the world that can exhibit chakra as corrosive as yours yet show no signs of internal damage. Tsunade couldn't help her eyes from rolling in annoyance. Really, she was the best medic in the world and the two didn't think she would eventually notice? You caught us. The older blonde raised an eyebrow at Naruto, who was shrugging nonchalantly. Fo is the Jinchuriki of the Nanabi no Kabutomushi. Tsunade just glanced at the girl who was now looking down at her feet and frowned. This was very serious. A Jinchuriki out of their village on unsanctioned business, which this clearly was, could be grounds for war if they believed another country might be harboring them. Last she knew, the Nanabi was in the possession of Taki, a longtime ally of Konoha. If they went to war, then her village would be dragged along with them out of obligation. While her care for her village had definitely waned over the years after the death of her lover and brother, she couldn't deny a small part of her would always consider it her home. She had experienced the horror of 2 shinobi wars. She never wanted to subject anybody to that if she could help it. The obvious thing to do would be to take Fo back to Taki. Yet, as she looked down at the girl cowering under her penetrating eyes, no doubt fearing her next action, she couldn't bring herself to do it. Jinchuriki lived notoriously harsh lives under the scorn and hatred of their village, the Mizukage and the Kumo Jinchuriki being notable exceptions. If Fo had left her village, it was obviously for good reason. She suspected Naruto had something to do with it. She could only feel sorry for the poor kid that the fourth Hokage had stuck the Kyuubi in before he died, whoever it was. Jiraiya had been far too depressed when he had come to deliver the news of the Hokage's death for her to get a name from him. Fo flinched again at the woman's neutral hum. Her immediate fate rested on the woman's next words. She was sure Naruto would come to her aid if anything were to happen, and she could take care of herself to a degree, but this was still Tsunade of the Densetsu no Sannin. The woman's penetrating green eyes continued to bore into the top of her skull for a few more moments before she finally released a small sigh. Well, that explains why you keep killing the damn fish. Fo blinked in surprise. Of all the accusations, questions and possible actions she had been preparing herself for, that response was not one that she had imagined. What you need to do is learn how to separate the bug's chakra from yours, otherwise you'll keep injecting that poisonous stuff into them. She patted the younger girl on the back with a hard slap, and her trademark training grin. I'm sure you'll get it, you just need to up your training a bit. Fo just blinked again, unsure of whether to groan like she might have only a few minutes ago, or just sit there, dazed and confused. When she turned to look at Naruto, the blonde sported a small compassionate smile that managed to ease a few of the worries in her mind before he returned to his own exercise. Fo found a small smile of her own creeping along her face. She felt oddly light all of a sudden. It had been a month since the revelation over Fo's tenant and the subsequent fallout. Naturally, Tsunade was curious as to what else they might have been hiding from her, so Naruto thought that was the best time to reveal his Rinnegan. He had come to trust Tsunade and Shizune over the time they had been together. While she may have been a harsh trainer, she definitely showed her kinder moments. It helped that she had reacted favorably to Fu being a Jinchuriki. In the silence between the revelation and her answer, he had been molding his chakra to make an escape if need be. However, he had thought it best he didn't reveal his own tenets. He was confident in his ability to keep them hidden from the older medic, and it would only raise awkward questions for both him and Fu. Knowing Fu was a Jinchuriki was one thing, knowing Naruto held 5 of the bijou, one from each major country on the continent, was an entirely different matter. Of course, Tsunade responded to the discovery of his Jujutsu in a way he had come to expect, with more training. The blonde grunted in pain, but gritted his teeth as he deftly moved to the side to avoid the backhand that would have sent him crashing into a few trees. Tsunade stood across from him, a cocky smirk plastered over her face as she placed a hand on her hip. Getting tired already, brat? You were the one who came to me asking to test out your new taijutsu style. Naruto just spat out some blood in annoyance as he tensed his muscles again, feeling for the chakra slowly flowing through his coils. It had seemed like such a good idea at the time, send earth chakra through his body, hardening his skin and making himself more dense and therefore less prone to damage. So far it had shown a good effectiveness against sharp weaponry, as kunai that would have embedded in his limbs only gave him small cuts. Unfortunately for him, blunt force trauma was much more effective against him, able to reach past his earth-hardened skin to his more delicate and unprotected organs. He had come to Tsunade to try and either find a way around this or to increase the power of the ability and provide himself a stronger defense. Unfortunately, it seemed to be a bit of a trade-off. The more he focused on hardening his skin, the less he was able to focus on moving around. It was a very sedentary taijutsu style, solely based on defense. Right now, he was trying to improve the time it took him to switch between chakra natures, seeing how quickly he could go from agile and light to heavy and durable. It was why he kept getting sent through the foliage in the clearing. He was too slow getting his defense up to block Tsunade's powerful fists in time. It didn't really help that the woman was taking this as an opportunity to take off the training gloves, as it were, using much more of her considerable strength than she normally would. There was also the small fact Naruto kept getting distracted as he watched her move so gracefully. She really was the epitome of a kunoichi, fast and poised yet powerful to the point she was famed for her strength. He could also see her chakra as it moved, so calm and collected, only using the exact right amount for everything without anything wasted. It was incredible to watch the chakra collect in her fist, while it simultaneously strengthened the muscles and bones in her arm, spine, hips and legs while sticking her to the floor to avoid recoil, all in a split second. He shook himself of his distraction as he ducked under a fast swing from the older blonde. It was embarrassing how much he could see she was holding back on her punches, no matter how much she said she was serious. As he scooted backward, he twisted his body this way and that, regretting the stipulation he had put on the spar not to use his sand or deva path. His eyes widened when he saw Tsunade's other fist coming out from his blind spot. He was only able to see it because he had a clone watching the spar in detail. With no time to dodge and his normal reactionary responses out of the question, he did the only thing he could. He sent as much earth chakra to his arms as he physically could in the time he had and raised them up to block the blow. He already knew it wouldn't be enough before the woman's fist made contact, even so he was wholly unprepared. He could literally feel the shock travel down his arms, bending his bones slightly as he found his feet uprooted from the ground, despite the chakra he had channeled there. It only took him a few seconds to fly through the air, but with the fresh throbbing pain in his arms, only dampened slightly by his defense, it felt much longer. Luckily, he wasn't too out of it that he wasn't able to twist his body and land on a tree trunk as opposed to going straight through it. With a wince of pain, he dropped to the ground again, panting slightly from both the strain on his coils from holding natured chakra within his body and the blow itself. HMPF, right now this new style isn't looking all that impressive. Naruto looked up to see Tsunade standing over him with her usual smirk as she held out a hand for him. He took it with a grateful smile only to wince again, as she applied a little too much pressure to his forearm. He had noticed that while a smirk was never too far away from the older blonde's face, he could discern her emotions from it in the same way he could Fu's emotionless facade. Right now, she had what he liked to call her warm smirk, the same one she got when she looked at him as if she was remembering some fond memory. Give it time, nothing ever came from doing no work. Tsunade just shrugged at that as she dropped back into a loose combat stance. She had no real taijutsu style, mostly relying on her immense speed and strength. It wasn't exactly a crutch as they made her a truly fearsome opponent all the same. Whatever, it's a nice chance to let loose. Naruto smiled as he adopted the starting stance for his new style and progress, the Tsuchi no Mai. The two quickly got back into it, with Naruto doing his best not to get hit, or at least minimize the damage to glancing blows. Tsunade on the other hand was having a surprising amount of fun. She had thought that training these two kids might bring up a lot of bad memories, but quite the opposite was true. It was like while she focused on them, she didn't have to think about her past. She had even cut down on her drinking, slightly. Don't get distracted. Tsunade had seen Naruto's eyes drift slightly again. She wasn't sure what it was he was thinking about, but losing concentration like that could be fatal in a fight. She made sure to rectify this by putting him through a few trees. After all, nothing hammers a point home like a lingering ache. Naruto for his part merely widened his eyes slightly as he found himself in a familiar situation, facing down the business end of Tsunade's fist. Once again he was left with little option but to block the attack with his earth-enhanced arms. Come on, harden the skin, harder than rocks, denser than stone. He gritted his teeth in apprehension, time seeming to slow around him as the fist came closer. He could see even more chakra in the punch than before, and right now he really did not want to be hit by that. No, harder than that, dense like metal, strong, unbreakable. Naruto suddenly felt a surge of chakra pulse outwards through his body, as he found his arm rising up of its own accord. Azura path. There was a horrendous sound of twisting metal that screeched throughout the clearing as a sudden shockwave of displaced air blew outwards, picking up a large cloud of dust. When it finally dissipated, it revealed Tsunade looking down incredulously at her fist, caught in Naruto's hand. A small crater had been created under his feet from the pressure, but Naruto didn't even look injured in the slightest. Sure, Tsunade wasn't going all out, Naruto would be a stain on the floor otherwise, but there was no way he should have been able to block her blows, never mind catch them. What? Naruto seemed equally as confused as the older blonde, looking at the hand currently curled around Tsunade's fist with disbelieving awe. The older woman was the first to snap out of it as she pulled her hand back instinctively, only to become even more amazed as she took a step back. "What's going on, brat?" Naruto just stood there frozen, staring at his hand wordlessly. It had a large indentation in the palm that looked as though somebody had driven a jackhammer into a metal wall. Before his very eyes it began to correct itself, the skin popping back out to normal as if the damage had never been there. Experimentally he moved his fingers, his eyes widening in surprise as they clacked against one another with a metallic ring. When the dent had fully healed, the clicking stopped as Naruto felt his hand return to normal, no sign that it had ever happened at all. "Hey brat." Naruto jolted out of his stupor as Tsunade waved a hand in front of his face, before a large grin suddenly spread across his fox-like features. "The fifth path." He ran off suddenly in the direction they had made camp, leaving Tsunade staring at the small dust cloud with his vague image, highly confused. It was a few months before Naruto really got the hang of his new ability, but most of that time was experimenting with what he could do with his Azura path. After the adrenaline rush from the first time, he realized it was actually rather disconcerting having parts of his body change into machinery and back. He could still technically feel things, but it was like holding them through gloves, very cold, very solid gloves. The worst part was the switching between his normal body and whatever he thought of. Other than that, he found that the only real limits were what he could imagine. They even had a day where everybody would just call out random things that he would try to change into. It was similar to the first time he unlocked his animal path, except far stranger for him, and a lot more energy-consuming. The first time he had discovered that he could fire off blasts of concentrated chakra from various parts of his body had been a strange day. Needless to say, he had marked that particular ability as a last resort. He mostly used the ability in conjunction with his Tsuchi no Mai in order to harden his skin while diverting earth chakra to solidify the rest of his body. It provided him with an excellent defense, one that required around 60% of Tsunade's strength before he would even start to feel impacts. They hadn't tried any higher than that in fear of doing serious damage, but Naruto was sure he could take even more punishment, which would hopefully improve as he came to understand and control his abilities better. Right now, Naruto was taking what he thought to be a well-deserved break from training, sitting outside of a small tea house in the town they had stopped over in. Tsunade moved around a lot, which wasn't too abnormal for Naruto and Fu, but the difference was that she rarely stayed anywhere for more than 3 days. It made Naruto appreciate the small comforts like having a relaxing cup of tea before going back to more tortuous training. "Any good, brat?" Naruto looked up to see Tsunade pulling out the chair across the table from him. It wasn't too unusual for her to come find him at times like these. Shizune had taken a particular liking to Fu, and the two often went off to train their medical ninjutsu together. Shizune could relate to the younger girl as a fellow apprentice of the slug Sennin that wasn't truly prodigious like Naruto. Naruto also liked that Fu finally had somebody else to talk to now other than him. The fact Shizune was also a woman was only a plus. "Good enough." Tsunade nodded as she signaled for one of the passing waiters to bring her a cup. Naruto simply stared at her for a few moments with a raised eyebrow until the woman caught the look. "What? I'm allowed to have a drink other than sake once in a while." Naruto simply shrugged indifferently as he took another sip from his cup, still keeping that rather incredulous look trained on the Sannin. They sat there in silence for a while, only the sipping of the tea breaking the monotony as Naruto thought about various things as he usually did. Eventually something caught his eye and Tsunade suddenly felt his eyes fall on her, and looked up questioningly. "I've never asked before, but what is the diamond on your forehead for?" Tsunade's brow rose for a moment as she instinctively reached up to gently touch the small symbol that had been a part of her for decades now, not that she would ever admit it was that long. She stared at Naruto appraisingly for a moment before sighing. As much as she was loath to admit, having the two kids around really was helpful. she rarely thought of her deceased loved ones as much anymore, and she actually felt herself becoming somewhat happier. The ever-present need to distract herself in drunken stupors and losing herself in the thrill of gambling, regardless of whether she won or not, had been dampened as of late. She felt genuinely lucky that the two had managed to find her, even if they had been somewhat annoying to begin with. Just the fact that Naruto was a once-in-a-lifetime prodigy helped somewhat. He soaked up everything she taught him like a sponge. Even the things she made intentionally too difficult for his level were mastered when he really dug into them. It's my Ein seal. At Naruto's uncomprehending blink, she sighed before elaborating. It naturally collects my chakra over time, siphoning it off from the Kaimon and storing it. When I release the seal, my body takes the sudden influx of chakra to activate my Suzu. With it I could regenerate from normally life-threatening injuries in a matter of seconds. Naruto nodded in amazement before frowning, which earned a small smirk from the woman as she realized Naruto was thinking a bit more like a ninja, looking underneath the underneath. There must be some kind of drawback to a technique like that, or else every ninja would have won. Tsunade's smirk grew as she leaned forward, her cup of tea forgotten for the moment as she studied Naruto's reaction intently. Go on then, brat, use what I've taught you and work it out. Naruto frowned again as his hands clasped together in front of him. He had read enough medical scrolls to have a basic understanding of what Tsunade had told him, but it seemed like an incredibly complex technique combining Fuinjutsu and Iriajutsu. Cells can only multiply a limited number of times. Tsunade leaned back, a moderately impressed expression crossing her face briefly. She hadn't expected him to get it so quickly, but then again, Naruto rarely conformed to people's expectations. That means using the technique would shorten your lifespan, maybe years depending on how severe the injury was. He looked down again in thought as Tsunade watched him curiously from behind her teacup. But you would also already need a large enough chakra reserve that siphoning some off over the years wouldn't affect you detrimentally. Another smirk crossed over the woman's lips. Now she was really impressed. She schooled her features though when Naruto looked back up. But why is it called a Ein seal and not a chakra storage seal? Tsunade blinked. She hadn't expected that question. Just another example of Naruto surprising her yet again. Because it separates chakra into Yin and Yang, only storing the Yin portion, while the Yang circulates my body and disperses like normal chakra. Naruto just blinked confusedly as he looked up at the little blue diamond on her forehead again. Yin and Yang? Tsunade blinked in surprise. She had been operating under the assumption Naruto knew about the two halves of chakra. Sometimes she really had to remind herself she was speaking to a 12-year-old, and not a colleague in the medical profession. It was just disconcerting that he could act so mature. That's right, I suppose Yin and Yang chakra would be a little advanced for you. Naruto just nodded slowly, suddenly rather interested in the direction the conversation had taken for some reason. You know that chakra is composed of physical and spiritual energies? At Naruto's nod, she simply carried on. Well, Yin and Yang are a more powerful, more practical versions of those that you can actually use and control with enough practice. Many clan techniques that are not specifically Kekkei Jinkai rely on Yin or Yang manipulation, just like many medical techniques are a subconscious use of Yang chakra as a revitalizing agent and Yin chakra as a stimulant. Naruto blinked in surprise. There were gears in his head that were spinning rapidly but refused to mesh. Chakra is naturally composed of a combination of both Yin and Yang, just like the two energies it is comprised of. However, unlike those, the combination of the two isn't necessarily even. Some people are more predisposed to Yang or Yin chakra than the counterpart, while some have a more balanced chakra. There have been a few studies into it, but right now it's still a fairly untapped field. Mostly we just know that Yin chakra governs imagination and body, while Yang chakra governs form and life. Naruto's eyes suddenly widened in shock as the cogs finally meshed together, and what Matatabi had said so long ago was beginning to make sense. So that's what I was missing. Tsunade looked up from her tea, having heard Naruto whisper something but not quite catching it. Ha, you say something, brat. Naruto suddenly jerked up in surprise before quickly composing itself. However, Tsunade had already caught it. Ah yeah, I was wondering if you could teach me about separating my chakra into yin and yang. Tsunade blinked as she took another small sip, her eyes narrowing slightly at the younger blonde. She knew there was something else on his mind, but she somewhat trusted him to come to her if it was important enough. That's a very complicated aspect of chakra manipulation, you know. Some people can't even do it due to having too much of one or the other in their system. Naruto just smiled as he felt his nerves settling down. Under the surface though he was bubbling with excitement. However, Tsunade didn't know about the Banbutsu Suzu, so he had to play it down for a few moments. I can handle it. Tsunade stared at him for a moment with calculating eyes before nodding with a smirk. All right then. She took a small sip as Naruto breathed a small sigh of relief, before it caught in his breath as he saw the smirk slowly travel along the woman's face. Of course, don't think you're getting out of your other training, this is just extra. There was a dangerous glint in the woman's eyes that made Naruto incredibly nervous for a moment, and he quickly tried to divert the conversation. So in the Yin seal, how do you regenerate nerve cells? Tsunade raised an eyebrow at the not too subtle change in conversation, but decided to simply humor the boy. She was sure after a few more weeks of her training, he would be willing to tell her anything she wanted. Well, now that's the interesting part, isn't it? Naruto steadied his breathing for a moment, catching himself with a hand on the ground before he could completely collapse. He was already fairly exhausted from the training throughout the day, and what he was attempting wasn't exactly chakra-light. Fu sat off to one side, watching him curiously as a blue glow faded from his right hand. She was there in case he completely passed out, and as an excuse to Tsunade about the massive amounts of chakra he was releasing. Later on, he could say they were sparring. It had been around a month since he had started to learn about the properties of yin and yang chakra, and a few days ago he had finally succeeded in splitting it, even if for only a moment. It was why he finally felt confident enough to try what he liked to think of as the complete Banbutsu Suzu. Unfortunately, he didn't take into account just how monumentally draining trying something like that could be. Even maintaining the blue flames over his right hand that he now understood to be a representation of his yin chakra proved challenging. Maybe you should rest and try again tomorrow? Naruto looked up with an appreciative smile at Fu sitting across for him, obvious concern etched on her features as she looked at his even more obviously exhausted form. It's all right, I still have plenty in me. Fu frowned, he certainly didn't look it. In fact, he pretty much seemed to be running on fumes at this point, and she didn't want him to overexert himself. She knew the only thing standing between the world and the 5 bijou contained within him was his chakra, and if he exhausted that then they were more likely to escape or for the seal to weaken. However, she trusted Naruto not to go too overboard, so sat back, ready to catch him if he went too far. Maybe I'm just being too ambitious creating something from the start? He looked down at the black dust in his palm, letting it fall to the ground harmlessly as it dissolved away. He frowned for a moment as he thought about what he could do in order to ease himself into the technique that wouldn't completely exhaust his reserves. As he turned his head, looking around the small clearing they were in, he felt the Magatama earring he had gotten from Sora brush against the side of his head. Curiously, he took it out of his ear and stared at it for a moment as if it contained all the answers to his problems. I wonder. Fu looked on curiously as the hand holding the earring began to glow with blue fire. For a moment she feared he had burnt away the earring, something he knew was a present from a close friend of his. Then his other hand began to glow, this time with an unnaturally crimson flame that contrasted with the fire in his right hand. Then, he brought the two together, clasping his hands over the small porcelain earring, as it was enveloped in a roaring purple flame. A few beads of sweat managed to drop from his forehead as he concentrated intently, and his breath became more labored. There. The flame suddenly died away, leaving a brief purple afterimage in Fu's eyes that took a moment to clear. When it did, she raised her brow at the two identical Magatama now sitting in Naruto's hand. The blonde seemed just as surprised as he looked at the two identical earrings. Quickly though his look of astonishment dissolved into a face-splitting grin. He could feel it, even though he could see and feel that there was absolutely no difference between the two. It was more than that, He was no longer connected to the earring like he would be if it was just made from his Yin chakra. It was a completely separate entity from him. Experimentally he tried to revert either of the two into the black chakra dust, but found that he couldn't. He had really created something lasting in the world purely from his own chakra. With that same grin stuck on his face, his hand began to light up in blue flame again. He had some practicing to do. Chapter 41, Flame's Eye. The air was still and the trees had ceased their swaying for the moment as the small group made their way along the narrow, but well-trodden road along the southeast outskirts of Hi-no-Kuni. It really was a peaceful day, with only the lightest hints of a natural fog blowing in from the nearby coast to ruin their view of it. Birds flew overhead and insects could be heard buzzing away in the forestry on their left. In all, the sounds of nature permeated the pathway and surrounded them on all sides. Erg. Of course, that wasn't the only sound to be heard. A woman's groan as she held her head also managed to disturb the delicate ecosystem around them. Tsunade didn't look so good as she walked along with a hand held perpetually to her temple, gently rubbing there as if she could simply will the headache away. They had to leave the last village they were in rather quickly due to one of Tsunade's debts having caught up to her, and she hadn't had the time to do her usual hangover removal technique that morning. Unfortunately for her, it became less effective the longer she put it off, and now she had to deal with an only somewhat dulled ache behind her eyes. Erg. Naruto simply sighed as he walked along behind the woman, Shikuju gently jingling with each step as he soaked in what little silence he could between each successive groan. It gave him a lot of time to think over the past year he had spent with his latest sensei and sister figure. The training for the most part was particularly brutal and Tsunade was rarely in a forgiving mood during it, but he was sure she had warmed up to both him and Fu in the time they had spent together. He could literally see her smiling more and more as the weeks passed and turned slowly into months. Erg. His eye twitched lightly as another of the older woman's pitiful groans tore through his serenity as her unanswered plea for sweet release went ignored. While Tsunade had gotten better in terms of drinking and gambling, there were just some personality traits far too deeply embedded in people to remove so easily. However, he knew he had gotten through to her as she had opened up a lot more, especially in the past few months. In their free time and between training or practice, she would regale them with stories from her early career, even a few more humorous ones from her genin days. You know, if you stopped drinking so much you wouldn't have to deal with these headaches at all. Tsunade merely shot him a particularly evil glare. It had been a topic of conversation they had spoken about many times in the past, only for it to go exactly the same way. Naruto would offer advice he thought helpful and Tsunade would completely ignore it. Shizune had once tried to get him to understand that the various less than reputable actions Tsunade partook in were simply distractions from her memories, but Naruto maintained there had to be a healthier way to go about it. Maybe if you drank you would understand. The woman winced as her own words cut into her skull like a rusty knife through a piece of metal, returning to rubbing her aching temples. Naruto smiled lightly at that. It was another thing to come about of their time together. Tsunade had made many attempts to get both Naruto and Fu to drink, which were quickly rebuked by the small monk. Fu, without his beliefs about clean body being tied with a clean mind and soul, had tried some. It turned out it was nigh impossible to get a Jinchuriki drunk. Their bodies simply purged the toxins from the alcohol too quickly for any noticeable effects to appear. Perhaps Tsunade, despite her pained state, actually raised an eyebrow. Naruto usually put up more of a fight than that, and his voice sounded strangely quiet. She had known him for a year now, and while he could be calm and peaceful as one would expect a monk to be, he was also opinionated and quite brash at times. Obviously the personality his training was suppressing to a degree. "What's wrong with you, brat? You're awfully quiet today." Naruto simply sighed. He wasn't sure if it was the stories about Tsunade's adventurous, and probably highly exaggerated, genin days or something else, but he was feeling terribly melancholic. "I'm just thinking." He looked outwards toward the ocean as the group continued down the path, Fu taking up the rear as she read through a small scroll Shizune had given her. However, she kept an ear open to the conversation all the same. Naruto had noticed Fu becoming a lot closer to him lately, quite literally. She would often stick by his side throughout most of the day, unless training demanded they separate, and often tried to sneak into his bedroom to sleep. Naruto wasn't sure what to make of it, but he really didn't mind, so he humored the girl until she either got over it or decided to talk to him about whatever it was. "I'll be 13 in a few weeks. If I had stayed in Konoha, I would be a genin by now." Despite the group being quiet before, the new silence that overtook them seemed far more oppressive. With Tsunade in the group, bringing up Konoha was usually a conversation ender, however it was a sore spot for everybody. For Shizen it was the home she hadn't been to in almost 2 decades, and for Fu it was the place that had hurt Naruto, but ultimately it was the same place that led to him rescuing her. She often felt guilty for thinking that it was a good thing Konoha had been so cruel to him, otherwise she shuddered to think what might be happening to her right now. "Yeah, I guess you would." Naruto looked up, surprised it was Tsunade who had spoken first. "That is, if you passed the graduation exams. I bet without all that fancy monk training you'd be some loudmouth idiot screaming about this or that and far too hyper to sit down and actually study." Tsunade snorted at her own joke before smiling sadly. She wasn't an idiot. It hadn't taken her long to realize the similarities between Naruto and the 4th Hokage. She remembered Kushina too from before she left the village, and often saw some of her traits shine through in their son. He had his father's perception that she was sure he would most likely lack if it had never been honed and brought out in the fire temple. There was the occasional slip of the tongue in the form of a tick that was so reminiscent of the way the young red-haired Uzumaki had spoken. It almost pained her every time she heard him mention the fact he wasn't sure if he was a true Uzumaki or not, dreading to think what Kushina might have done if she had heard that. She wasn't entirely sure what Sarutobi was thinking keeping the boy's heritage from him, but she still had a little faith in her old sensei, enough not to say anything yet anyway. It certainly didn't stop her from trying to drop the occasional subtle hint. "Hey, I wouldn't be that bad." Tsunade just snorted, turning away from the younger blonde as she continued on. The conversation was starting to become a little too loud for her anyway. "Sure, I bet you would be addicted to ramen or some other unhealthy food as well." The woman smirked as they walked, but it dropped from her face when there was no response from Naruto. She looked back only to see Naruto staring at the ground, his eyes low for a moment as he suddenly seemed a few years older. It passed almost as quickly as it was there, but that hadn't stopped Tsunade from noticing. "Nah, come on, Fu, back me up here." The girl looked up, startled out of her reading, as she was suddenly pulled into the conversation. She tried to shrink back into her scroll at the expectant gazes from Tsunade and Naruto. "I would rather not get involved." A small blush appeared on her face as Naruto flopped forward comically, none of the previous angst present on his face anymore. "I can't win." Fu smiled lightly before returning to her scroll. She was trying to understand how to better refine her chakra, and while Shizen was helpful, the scrolls were much more relevant to her situation. Us girls have to stick together." Tsunade strode on with a little more confidence in her step. She could somewhat feel her headache abating in the fresh air and warm sun. They walked on for a little longer, and the mist around them began to become stronger, blocking out the view more than 20 meters ahead of them. Naruto was looking around curiously. It reminded him a lot of their time in Mizu no Kuni, but with less loyalist forces trying to ambush them at every available moment. "Should the mist be this bad out here?" Tsunade looked back over her shoulder at the young monk, her headache officially gone now that it was almost midday. "Yeah, it's usually like this around here. It's because of Nami no Kuni just out to sea there." She pointed off towards the coast where the mist seemed even heavier. Naruto looked over curiously, trying to peer through the thick fog, but to no avail. Even his Rinnegan couldn't pierce the heavy veil. "Nami no Kuni?" Naruto had studied a few maps, but the smaller, less talked about nations hadn't really interested him all that much. Now that he was older and better traveled, he found himself more attracted to the so-called minor countries. Tsunade simply waved her hand absently as she continued down the path. Currently they were heading in the direction of Batafukugai for a small gambling tournament that she had heard about. It's a little island nation, Hi no Kuni has some trade agreements with it, but it mostly deals with fishing and ships. Some major cargo and shipping companies set up shop there a while back, and after that the country went sort of quiet. Naruto raised an eyebrow at that, but Tsunade caught it and quickly waved him off. Don't get any ideas, kid, there's nothing mysterious about it. It's fairly common for a small country to isolate itself for a while when they go through a bit of hardship. The woman hoped that would placate the blonde, but she groaned when that gleam entered his eyes. Hardship. Tsunade suppressed another groan. She felt as though she had dug her own grave with this. You're not going to let this go, are you? It wasn't really a question, but Naruto shook his head anyway, causing Tsunade's head to sag down. Look, I don't know much, but apparently when that big shipping business moved in and set up shop the country practically shut down its borders. Only the company's ships got in or out, but before the lockdown went into effect a few people made it out. It's mostly just rumors at this point, but apparently there was talk of the villages on the island falling into hard times. She sighed as she looked back around, already predicating the determined look she would find on Naruto's face. Look kid, I already know what you're going to say, and it's a bad idea. The affairs of an entire country are not your concern, don't make them your problem too, it's just not worth it. Naruto frowned at the older woman as he looked out in what he thought was the country's direction again, as if he could see all the way there. But don't we have an obligation to help them if they really are struggling? You're a medic. Tsunade sighed again. Sometimes Naruto was just too good for his own good. Naruto, I am a medic, but I'm a shinobi as well. And if there's one thing that lifestyle teaches you, it's don't get involved in somebody else's business without compensation. She sighed, raising her hand to stop whatever it was Naruto was about to say next. But I already know you, brat, despite what you may think. You'll go off and help them no matter what I say. She sighed again, rubbing the bridge of her nose tiredly. When she had run out on the last town, she never would have thought she'd have to deal with this. She should have just kept her mouth closed. Fine, you know what? A small smile crept onto her face as she continued to rub the bridge of her nose, something that would have been impossible for her a year ago. Consider this your first test. Naruto just blinked rapidly before a confused frown found itself onto his face. What do you mean? You have given us both tests before. Tsunade just gave a small smile, one Naruto hadn't seen since he first started traveling with the woman. It held hints of melancholy, and he immediately knew she had lost herself in one of her memories. He just coughed to bring her out of it. In Konoha, the genin pass a test to graduate from the academy. It tests the abilities they should have learned there. However, to become a shinobi they have to pass another test that determines whether they can actually use those skills practically. This is their true genin test. Her melancholic smile turned into a smirk as some of her usual confident attitude returned to her. This is your proper test. You know the skills. I've taught you enough for most Irionin to make a solid base on in about a quarter of the time. Now you need to go see what it's really like for a medic out there. Her smile once again became saddened, but it was gone almost as soon as it was noticeable. I thought we weren't supposed to stop until our training is complete? Tsunade sighed as she turned around, continuing on down the path that seemed to stretch on endlessly into the mist. Who said anything about your training being complete? The woman smirked again as Naruto and Fu quickened their pace to keep up with her long strides. They were still kids with small legs after all. There's more to training than just learning techniques and reading scrolls. Experience is the most valuable training you can get. Only a naive child believes that all they need to do is memorize a lot of facts to really learn how to accomplish something. You can't learn how to swim without getting in water, can you? Naruto was beside her so he couldn't see the slightly haunted look enter her eyes. She quickly shook herself of it though. Tsunade's words sounded confident and even planned, but internally she knew that if Naruto went off to Nami no Kuni the chances of them meeting again were slim with no way to communicate. She knew about his ability to summon things of course, but the idea of suddenly being whisked away at any point didn't really appeal to her. She didn't know what she would be doing or how important it would be at the time. Naruto's range with his water-sensing ability had increased over the year, but not to that extent, and the further he extended it the harder it was to pinpoint a specific signature. She sighed sadly. The last year had been a good one, definitely one of the better in her life, and she was actually remiss to see it end. As much as she would deny it, Naruto and Fu had really grown on her, and not waking up to torment them with training or discuss different medical topics with Naruto would actually be strange. It would just be her and Shizune again, out on the road. I don't know what to say. Naruto just seemed shocked. He had never expected Tsunade to simply release them like this. Sure, at first, she hadn't been ecstatic to have them tagging along with her, but bonds had been formed over the last year, and he just didn't expect her to let them go so easily. Fu seemed equally at a loss for words, or maybe she was just being quiet like normal. It was really hard to tell with that girl. Then don't say anything, goodbyes always get too sappy anyway. Naruto just smiled at that. He hoped Tsunade would never change too much. He would miss that slightly abrasive attitude. It was refreshing to have somebody to actually argue and discuss things with like equals. The group had stopped, now standing directly west of Nami no Kuni, and if the fog wasn't present the dim outline of the coast would have been visible. Despite Tsunade's comment though, Naruto quickly stepped forward, surprising the older woman as he wrapped his arms around her waist, tactfully avoiding placing his head between her cleavage. Thank you for everything, Tsunade-sensei. The older blonde suddenly froze in the contact, memories of her younger brother suddenly assaulting her in a barrage. I can't express how much I appreciate you teaching me over this last year. I know you didn't have to. He released the still frozen woman from the embrace with a large smile aimed up at her. You've been the closest thing to a mother I've ever had. If Tsunade had been shocked before, now she was nearly comatose. She actually staggered back as if Naruto had visibly struck her, shock written over her features. What? Naruto paused a moment, confused by Tsunade's reaction before a small sad smile appeared on his face. I never knew my mother, and the matrons in the orphanage avoided me as much as possible. The Hokage was like a grandfather to me, but I've always wondered what it would be like to have a mother. I like to think that traveling with you is as close as I will get. Tsunade suddenly found her breath catching in her throat as she lunged forward, catching up Naruto in a bone-crushing hug. This time the younger blonde had no choice as his head was buried in the woman's expansive bosom. Damn you, brat, I told you about the goodbyes. Tears were beginning to gather in the corners of Tsunade's eyes as she attempted to crush Naruto with her hug, the boy's face turning an unhealthy shade of blue as he gasped in air. She bit them back valiantly though as she finally released him, wiping away those that managed to escape quickly. She leant back up, coughing to clear her throat so she was sure it wouldn't catch when she talked. Come on, Shizune, I need to leave now before this gets all emotional. The younger woman, who had just finished saying goodbye to Fu, nodded with a smile of her own on her face. She would be sad to leave the two kids she had come to see as younger siblings, but ultimately her place was at Tsunade's side. Goodbye, Tsunade-sensei. The Sannin gritted her teeth as she walked away, and against her better judgment, as well as the loud voice in her head, she looked back one last time. Her breath nearly left her again as behind Naruto, she swore she could see the faint images of Nawaki and Dan, both giving her warm smiles as they rested a hand on the young monk's shoulders. She turned back around, striding off until the mist finally separated the two groups. Then, and only then, did she allow a single tear to slowly drift down her cheek. Don't die, Naruto. Naruto looked down at his hand as he and Fu walked along the path in a different direction, hopefully towards a port town or a dock where they could get a boat over to Nami no Kuni. When she was hugging him, Tsunade had managed to slip a small scroll into one of his pouches. He smirked as he walked. He hadn't even felt her do it. He slipped the scroll back into the pouch, making sure to remember to look at it later when they had some time. Instead, he looked around, noting that the scenery hadn't changed, forest on one side, coast on the other, and mist all around. In the absence of anything else, his gaze drifted to Fu, just watching her for a moment out of the corner of his eye. She had grown up a bit in the last year, her frame starting to fill out as she reached the cusp of adolescence. Her clothing choice had changed again, returning to her white-on-white color scheme that she had abandoned in Mizu no Kuni in favor of more camouflaging colors. She had also found a small orange hair clip in one of the towns they passed, matching the color of her eyes, and had taken to wearing it to keep her now shoulder-length hair parted to the right with a long green bang sweeping down the rest of her face. That wasn't to say Naruto hadn't changed, he too had grown with another year at his back. His spiky ponytail was now dangling between his shoulder blades and his hair had become even messier. He had given up pretenses of controlling it and now simply allowed it to grow wherever it pleased. The forehead protector from Nadeshiko village still kept it out of his eyes though. His training with Tsunade had also added some muscle onto his small frame, not too much, but it was noticeable. He was leaner and more athletic than muscle, though, which he felt was more appropriate. You know, I wouldn't have stopped you if you had wanted to go with them. Fu blinked, having been lost in her own thoughts as they walked, only to be pulled out of them by Naruto's soft voice. What do you mean? Fu seemed genuinely confused, but Naruto's lips twitched up into a smile anyway. There was that calculating look in her eyes that Naruto loved to see. It meant she was really thinking about a situation. It wasn't cold or cruel. Fu simply liked to have as much information about a subject as possible. It was a trait the training with Tsunade and Shizune really brought out. If you had wanted to continue on with Tsunade and Shizune, complete your medical training with them, I wouldn't have stopped you. He didn't show it through his kind smile, but internally Naruto felt slightly ashamed. In his rush to help the people of Nami no Kuni, he had completely forgot about what Fu might think. It was selfish of him, and he was regretting it now. Fu just stared at him a moment, her face betraying nothing of her thoughts whatsoever. She had a better poker face than he did. Naruto actually felt a little nervous at the way the girl kept staring at him, her captivating orange eyes holding her attention. I decided a long time ago that wherever you go I will follow. Naruto blinked at that, wondering when she made that kind of decision, and whether or not she really thought it through. Then again, he had never really known Fu to make a decision rashly. She always thought things through before deciding on a course of action. But why? He blinked again in surprise when the girl just smiled, turning and walking on, his question going unanswered. After a moment his wits caught up to him, and he rushed off to catch up with her. Wait, Fu, what did you mean? The mysterious smile never left the girl's features as they two disappeared into the mist in the direction of Nami no Kuni. Fu was sitting alone at the edge of the training ground that had been rapidly constructed at the new base the rebels had moved to. They had gotten word Yugura had mobilized troops in their area, and had quickly deconstructed their camp and moved on. It happened every few weeks or so just to keep them one step ahead of the loyalists, and it really made no difference to the shinobi. To them the base wasn't a place, it was simply where their comrades were, where they laughed and drank together and simply enjoyed being alive for whatever time left they had. Right now, though Fu wasn't really feeling a part of it all, both Naruto and Shizuku had wasted no time in integrating themselves into the rebels, gaining friends and allies alike. Naruto had encouraged her to try the same, but it just wasn't a part of who she was. Having friends was just an alien concept to her. Having people to rely on, to trust, possibly with her life, she just couldn't do that. She had lived too long by her own strength, living day to day by her own power and stubbornness to keep moving. Naruto had freed her from that, but it was just too ingrained. The only person she could ever really trust was herself. Hey there! She nearly jumped as a familiar voice suddenly pulled her from her thoughts, whipping her head around so fast it made Shizuku laugh. Sorry, did I startle you? Fu merely grumbled incoherently to herself as she turned back around. Shizuku took that as an opportunity to sit down beside her. It's a nice night, everybody's in the mess tent celebrating the raid on that supply caravan earlier today. What are you doing out here? When Fu didn't answer her for a few seconds, she looked up at the sky. The mist had parted somewhat overhead, allowing the night sky above them full of stars to be partially visible, despite the thin rain making the little pinpricks of light slightly hazy. I don't belong with them. It had been around a minute of silence between them, so Shizuku was actually somewhat surprised when Fu finally spoke. I don't know how to talk to people like you and Naruto. I don't know what to say. Shizuku smiled softly at the other girl. She remembered being like that once, when the reins she carried drove people away from her. Naruto had changed all that, given her somebody to rely on, to trust and care about, so that those problems just seemed less important, and she hoped Fu would eventually feel the same way. Well, hello is always a good start. She smiled, but it lessened slightly when she saw Fu was still just staring on ahead passively. Give it time, these things don't come easily for a reason, important things never do. Fu nodded slowly but didn't say anything, just looking over to the flickering lights of the rest of the camp, the occasional laugh or cheer carried on the wind meeting her ears. The two girls sat like that in silence for a while. Despite the time they had spent traveling together, they really didn't talk all that much. Why do you follow Naruto? Again, the Violet was a little shocked as Fu suddenly spoke up, shattering the delicate silence between them. What do you mean? Fu looked around for the first time, shocking Shizuku with how empty her eyes seemed. They completely lacked purpose or intent. She looked so lost Shizuku just wanted to reach put and pull the other girl into a deep hug and never let go. You follow him for some reason, I just want to know what it is. Shizuku frowned worriedly at the tone in Fu's voice. She hadn't seen the girl like this since leaving Taki and wondered if Naruto had noticed it. She took a deep breath, feeling as though her next words would be very important and she had to get them right. I follow Naruto because I just don't see myself not doing so. Fu blinked once in confusion as her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, trying to figure out what Shizuku meant. He saved me and at first I followed him because I felt indebted to him. Fu nodded at that. She had felt somewhat the same after being rescued in Taki. She and Shizuku shared that much in common at least. Then I followed because he was an escape. An escape from everything I hated. Fu was back to confusion as she looked around at Shizuku. However, the girl was already gone, looking away into the distance with a fond smile. My life was so dull before he came along, a daily struggle to get enough food to keep going and enough money that I wouldn't be thrown out to the streets like I had seen so many others do. There was no sunlight back then, just endless stormy clouds. Naruto showed me something else, something different that was better, more exciting. His smile softened as her eyes traced random patterns in the ground. And he did all this without once asking for something in return. His smile brightened as she turned back to Fu, catching the girl's eyes with her own. It might have taken me a while to realize, but I follow Naruto because there is nobody else like him in the world, and I didn't want to miss a single moment with him. I will continue to follow him because I know that at the end of it all, when I can't follow him anymore for whatever reason, I will have no regrets. Her smile softened again as she broke eye contact with the vedette, looking down to her hands. You think a lot of him then? Shizuku simply nodded once as her eyes flickered towards the sounds of laughter. I meant what I said, there is nobody like Naruto. Fu frowned as she nodded once. She suddenly had a lot to think about. Now come on, you know Nezumiro will probably end up having to carry her back to her tent. Fu nodded again, this time a little quicker as she joined Shizuku in standing up as the two slowly made their way back towards the main camp. Thank you for that, Shizuku. The purple-haired girl just waved the thanks away with an absent flick of her wrist. It's no problem, that's what friends are for, right? Fu smiled softly as she released a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. Right, friends. Chapter 42, Flames 2. So, this is Nami no Kuni. Naruto's voice wasn't all that encouraging as the two slowly made their way down a large street in one of the few villages dotting the small island nation. Naruto was reminded of a few villages in Mizu no Kuni during the rebellion, the ones that had the misfortune to be in the contested area between the two forces. The streets and connecting alleyways were awash with people dressed in obviously well-worn clothing milling about without purpose. The only people that seemed to have anywhere to go were the fishermen, yet even they lacked any kind of energy in their movements. I never expected it to be this bad. Naruto looked around sadly as he saw a group of far too thin children sluggishly move past them, their sharp eyes no doubt darting around for potential marks to steal from. Store owners leant hopelessly against the counters of their stalls, their produce meager, and their customers practically non-existent. It had nearly broken Naruto's heart when he walked up to a young woman manning a small vegetable store, and her eyes practically lit up with him just buying a few apples. She had gushed uncontrollably with thanks while Naruto simply stood there awkwardly, unsure of how to react to such a thing. What could have caused all this? To his right, Fu shrugged stoically, but her eyes were still looking around, narrowed in anger at what had caused these people to live like this. The hopelessness, the fear, and submissive attitudes were all too familiar to the young Jinchuriki. She had seen it in her own reflection enough times. I think we should be asking what we could do to help. Naruto continued to look around sadly for a few moments before a look of pure determination entered his eyes. Right then, where do we start? He blinked when Fu didn't answer, and when he looked around she was gone. However, when he looked back he spotted a flash of mint-green hair surrounded by a sea of small children. He nearly laughed outright as he saw his friend getting swarmed by a veritable tide of the little urchins. It seemed she had given out a piece of food to one of the kids as they walked through the village, and word had spread quickly. With a smile he walked over to help Fu, seeing that she was vastly overwhelmed. Excuse me. The blonde suddenly froze as 10 pairs of eyes suddenly latched onto him, or more specifically the apple held in his hand. Can I get to my friend? All the eyes flickered back to Fu, who now looked rightfully frazzled, as if she had walked into a small hurricane. A young girl moved out of the group. She couldn't be more than 7 or 8 with spiky and unruly brown hair, wearing a shirt more than a few sizes too large for her that hung off one shoulder. Do you have any food, mister? Naruto found his gaze softening as those large, dark blue eyes gazed into his own and couldn't help but quickly hand over the apple in his hand. The little girl simply stared at him for a moment before her face lit up in an enormous beaming smile. She rushed forward in small legs and wrapped her stubby arms around him as best he could in a haphazard hug. As quickly as it happened, she let go and rushed off. He hoped to her home, but from the state of the children around them he figured they were most likely orphans. Eventually, after handing out a healthy amount of their food to the little kids, the two could move on again, not that they had any real destination. Fu fell into step beside him, looking a little rattled from her encounter with the swarm of homeless kids. Her eyes were down and she looked to be in deep thought as they walked, mostly ignoring what was around them. She wasn't sure what she would do if she looked for too long. We can't just hand out food to everybody we come across, you know that won't help anything. Naruto sighed but nodded slowly nonetheless. It was the beginnings of the conversation they had had about the exact same subject in Mizu no Kuni. I know that, but unless there is some kind of rebellion we can join, what else can I do? Fu looked back up, a hint of steel in her orange eyes, the same determination in her eyes as when she wanted to find Tsunade. We find out what caused this and stop it. Naruto sighed but nodded to at least humor his friend. He somehow didn't expect it to be nearly as easy as Fu tried to make it sound. Last time they helped change a nation, hopefully for the better. They had an entire army with them, and they still lost a friend. Now it was just the two of them, facing against an unknown enemy with only what supplies and skills they could bring with them. Come on, we'll go get something to eat, it will help us think. Fu barely even acknowledged him. She was too busy glaring on ahead, obviously too lost in thought over what she would do when she found out just what caused all this. They kept walking through the village until they ended up at a small udon noodle stand near the outer limits of the town. He picked it because it looked even more run down than the rest, business obviously suffering in whatever economic troubles the nation was going through. He sat down on one of the well-worn stools only to blink in confusion when there was nobody behind the counter. He drummed his fingers on the counter for a few minutes, waiting for somebody to come out only to hear scuffling in the back of the stand. You're hearing things, old man, nobody comes by here any dash. The young girl froze as she emerged from the small doorway leading into the back of the stand, her mouth agape at the sight of not only one but two customers sitting in front of the stand. She just stared for a few moments, giving Naruto a few minutes to take her in. She was around their age with lank brown hair that stretched messily down her back, tied back with a small white bandana, spotted with grease. She wore a similar apron over her long blue shirt and baggy brown pants. Oh. I'm sorry. She suddenly scrambled about, grabbing a pen and paper frantically before standing before them, a well-practiced, but still genuine smile across her dirt-smudged features. "I'm Marabi, can I take your order, customer-san?" Fo nodded slowly, still barely paying attention, as she absently motioned to the prawn udon on the small board behind them. The girl nodded happily as she wrote it down before turning to Naruto expectantly. Customer-san?" Naruto gulped slowly before blinking himself out of the stupor he had suddenly found himself in. For a second there, when the girl was still half shrouded in darkness, it wasn't Marabi standing there, smiling pleasantly at him, but I am instead. "Ah, yes, I'll have 2 beef." The girl nodded energetically again, scribbling the order down with practiced ease before ripping the small page up and tacking it to the board behind her. "Your orders will be right with you." With it she disappeared around the back of the stand again, quickly followed by the sounds of pans being rattled around and various cooking equipment being turned on. Naruto and Fu sat there in silence for a few more minutes, Fu brooding and Naruto trying to sort out what he saw before sighing. A small part of him knew that the memories of Ayam and Tucci wouldn't leave him, but he didn't think they would come back to haunt him like that. He had been about to shout in happiness at seeing her, reverting 6 years of training and growth in a few seconds. "Here we go, 1 prawn and 2 beef." The girl emerged again after a few minutes, expertly balancing the 3 bowls in her hands and in the crook of her arm, looking a bit sweatier from the hot equipment she was working with, and a few more grease spot dotted her apron. Naruto politely nodded while Fu grunted her semi-intelligible gratitude before idly playing with the noodles with her chopsticks. Mirabi leaned against the counter, looking at the two expectantly as they ate, mostly Naruto though, as Fu was just picking at hers. "So, what brings you here? You're obviously not from Nami no Kuni." Naruto just smiled through his mouthful before swallowing. "We're just traveling, heard Nami no Kuni was a good place to be right now." Mirabi just smiled sadly as she played with the hem of her apron. "I'm afraid you were misinformed then. I'd recommend you leave Nami soon, it's just not a good place for anyone to be right now." Naruto just continued to eat, but a small frown flickered over his face, quickly hidden as he sighed out in appreciation. "The noodles are very good." Mirabi gave him a beaming smile as she lightly flicked him across the face with a nearby cloth. "Well, look who's a flatterer, I don't think your girlfriend would be all that impressed if you kept that up." Naruto nearly choked on the mouthful of noodles as he spluttered in surprise. "Oh, what? No, Fu isn't my girlfriend, we just travel together." Fu didn't seem to have even noticed, just continuing to idly pick at her food in thought. Mirabi simply gave the two a skeptical look before shrugging nonchalantly. She was mostly glad for the opportunity to actually talk to people. "All right, thanks for the compliment anyway, it's my father's recipe, but I made them myself, so I'll take all the praise I can get." Naruto just gave a small nod as he hid his embarrassment with another mouthful of noodles. "So, is he about so I can compliment the recipe?" Mirabi just sighed as she leaned on her elbows, playing with the edge of the cloth boredly. "Nah. The old man's been holed up in bed with a fever for a while now." She sighed again, more deeply and with more frustration this time. "Not like there are any customers for business to take a hit anyway." Naruto just widened his eyes slightly, slurping down the rest of the sauce his bowl with a satisfied sigh. "Maybe I could help, my friend, and I know some medical ninjutsu." Mirabi looked up in surprise, not having expecting such an unassuming person to know such advanced techniques, especially somebody her age. "Oh, I couldn't ask you to do that." She looked down guiltily as she fiddled with the hem of her apron again. "We wouldn't have anything to pay you with." Naruto just gave a short laugh, using his last piece of beef to wipe up some broth from his bowl before happily eating it. "It's all right, we're just happy to help." Mirabi simply looked at him for a while with scrutinizing eyes, a habit gained from too many dishonest people making such false promises in her life. However, there wasn't a hint of deceit on Naruto's features, just a compassionate smile. Her shoulders finally relaxed as she motioned to the back of the stand, grabbing the 2 bowls Naruto had left on the counter and placing them in the back sink for later. If you really would, that would be great.
Medicine is too expensive for us right now, and I think he's been getting worse lately.
Naruto just nodded, his training kicking in as he noted the symptoms, narrowing down what he could be dealing with. He looked over only to see Fu hadn't even touched her food, and she still had that faraway look on her face. He sighed, not having expected Fu to be like this surrounded by things like this. She hadn't acted this way in Mizu no Kuni, so he wasn't sure what she was thinking about. Mirabi brought them around to the back of the stall, a small room with a couch, and a small table with two doors leading off to what he presumed was the bathroom and a bedroom. Once again, he had to quell the nostalgia welling up inside of him. While it wasn't identical, the familiarity of the room was unquestionable. He could see his 7-year-old self laughing happily as Tucci told him stories of when he was still a young chef, striking out on his own to find the perfect ramen recipe. Ayam would watch from the corner of the couch, smiling warmly at them both and giggling every time her father would make a fool of himself just to get a laugh from the young blonde.
So your father?
Naruto tore his eyes away from the room and pulled himself from his memories. It would do him no good to be distracted now. Yeah, the old man's back here. She moved over towards one of the doors, while Naruto smiled lightly at the disrespectful, but affectionately said name for her father. Walking through into the bedroom, Naruto half expected the man to be some clone of Tucci, now sure that Kami was messing with him. Luckily and thankfully for Naruto, he looked nothing like the old ramen chef. Instead, he was a tall man with steel-gray hair and an unruly beard. Naruto imagined that when standing he would pose quite the intimidating figure. Ah, so my ears weren't deceiving me, we really did have customers then. He smiled up congenially at the two before looking across at his daughter, a questioning look on his face.
Mirabi, what's going on?
The young brunette looked down sheepishly, fumbling with her hands, as she suddenly became nervous under the penetrating gaze of her father. They said they knew medical techniques, and with your fever getting worse. She was suddenly cut off as the man let out a barking laugh, his eyes sparkling with the mischief of a much younger man. Naruto had to admit he didn't look particularly sick, nor did he seem feverish, although he didn't have a basis of what he was usually like. Now, it's just a passing bug, there's no need to be calling in the medic just yet. I may not be as spry as I used to be, but this old horse has plenty more years in him.
Naruto smiled and gave a small nod, but was already moving towards the bed anyway. That may be the case, but it's always better to be safe than sorry, right?
The older man looked at the young monk for a few moments before a face-splitting grin passed over his face. Puffed, playing it safe is for those too cowardly to take a leap forward in life. Anyway, we would have nothing to pay you with, being dirt poor at the moment.
In the corner, Mirabi's eyes opened wide as she spluttered for a moment.
Dad.
The older man just paused for a moment before laughing again. Don't be like that, Mirachan, it's nothing to be ashamed of. It's not like it's our fault.
You know that if people had the money they would be flocking far and wide to our little stand.
A melancholic spark entered his eyes as he stared up at the ceiling. Best udon noodles in the world. Naruto just smiled sadly for a moment before his hand began to glow green with medical chakra. Don't worry about paying us, we're just happy to help. The man just stared at Naruto with a calculative stare for a few seconds before shrugging with that same childish grin that was too young for his grizzled face. Well, in that case, go right ahead. In the corner, Mirabi just planted her face in her hands, her face tinged red in embarrassment while her father chuckled. Never turn down free help, that's what Mikano always taught me. Despite his curiosity, Naruto didn't ask and instead just began to run his glowing hand along the man's body. The symptoms so far were vague and generic, so he just decided to do a full scan and sort out what was wrong from there. The mystic palm technique was a strange one, as the information from the scan would be translated directly into his mind, yet it was in a manner only a trained medic could actually discern anything from the seemingly useless jumble of information. It was like looking at a code. There was useful information there, but you had to be trained to see it. So, what symptoms have you been exhibiting and for how long? Naruto didn't really have to know, but Tsunade had told him light conversation would put a patient at ease,
making their body relax and diagnosis easier. "Oh, nothing much, I got a small headache a few weeks back, nothing too serious. Unfortunately, it kept coming back every few nights. Then, about a week ago I got one little tiny fever, and my daughter was practically beside herself with worry." He sent a poignant look at his daughter, who at this point seemed to have gotten over her embarrassment, and was just standing there with her arms crossed. "Well, excuse me for being worried, you old goat." The man simply laughed again jovially. "Ha! Her mother's daughter through and through." Mirabi just groaned, but a small smile was playing on her lips from behind her hands. Naruto smiled at the interaction and continued to scan the man up and down, before frowning as he rested it over the man's chest. His technique flickered for a moment as he tried to discern what he was seeing before finally letting it drop, allowing his features to fall into a more professional mask. "Have you been having any chest pains?" The older man blinked once before scratching his head in thought. "Well, my old body's got its occasional ache, sure, but I always thought it was some old injury acting up. I used to be a mercenary, see. But yeah, I suppose I've been having the occasional chest pain." He looked away sheepishly as he noticed his daughter's suddenly penetrating gaze. "Why?" Naruto just frowned as he passed a glowing hand over the man's chest one more time just to be sure. "You're developing a small clot in the artery leading to your heart. It's raising your blood pressure, which is the cause of the fevers and headaches. It's nothing to be too worried about. There's a simple herbal remedy that should break it up within a few weeks and allow it to harmlessly disperse in your blood." The older man just smiled happily at that, scratching his head again. "Well, that's good, isn't it?" Naruto just gave a small nod before looking away for a moment. He had never had to deal with a patient directly, and it was harder than he imagined, even after seeing Tsunade do it. If it hadn't been noticed, it would have continued to grow, eventually blocking the artery. If you didn't suffer an immediate heart attack, the added pressure would have put a serious strain on your heart, most likely rupturing the blood vessel and causing you to bleed out internally. The man suddenly gulped in surprise as his eyes widened. "I would have died?" Naruto nodded sadly before straightening up with what he hoped was a warm smile. "But like I said, it's nothing to worry about now. I'll give you the recipe for the medicine, and as long as you take it twice a day you'll be able to work again in around a week. Most of the herbs should grow in coastal regions, so you'll be able to find them quite easily." The man simply nodded numbly as Naruto quickly scribbled down the recipe for the medicine, as well as how to prepare it properly before leaving it on his bedside table. Well, I'd say the meal was on the house, but we really do need the money, you know." The man chuckled boisterously, obviously trying to hide his sudden shock, which didn't seem to last long as he sighed. "Really, as a young man I always thought I'd go down swinging, losing in honorable combat with a worthy opponent. To think a little bit of dried blood was nearly the end of me." He looked forward for a moment, unseeing before shaking his head of it. Well now it seems I'm in the awkward position of being indebted to you." Naruto just smiled congenially as he slid his small pad of papers back into a pouch. "There's no need for that, really." Suddenly though Naruto looked a finger coming to his chin in thought. "Well actually, I wouldn't mind some information." The man on the bedside gratefully, bringing a hand up to his forehead in a highly over-exaggerated display of relief. "Well, that's good. I thought I would have to give you Mirachan for a second there. He was swiftly cut off as a pillow struck him firmly in the face, a blushing and fuming Mirabi glaring at him murderously. Naruto simply chuckled at the scene as the older man removed the pillow from his face, hardly looking apologetic for his joke. "So, what do you want to know?" Naruto let his face become impassive and professional as he took a seat to the man's right. "Just what happened to Nami no Kuni?" Naruto left the small udon stand feeling troubled. The news he had gotten about Gato, and all the terrible things the man had done to the village kept playing over in his mind. When Isaki, as he had found out the man to be called, had spoken of Nami before Gato shipping came along, his eyes had been full of pleasant melancholy. However, talking about the man or what he had done, there was only anger and hatred. He sighed wearily as he walked back out into the street, full hot on his tail.
He felt slightly worried about the girl, not knowing what was going through her mind as she walked behind him in silence. Is something wrong, Fu? The verdette finally looked up from her brooding, staring at Naruto uncomprehendingly for a few seconds before blinking. I apologize, I was lost in my thoughts. Naruto smiled pleasantly as he slowed his pace until the two were side by side. Anything interesting? Fu stared for a moment again, obviously weighing her words carefully as she always did. Sometimes he liked that she was slow and meticulous with everything, but it often didn't help conversations along. To be honest, I was thinking about the many ways I would like to deal with this Gato person. Naruto stopped in the middle of the street, sighing into his hand. And by deal with you mean dash. Kill. Naruto blinked at the blunt response before walking again. The two needed to find a place to rest for the night, and he had yet to find an open inn. They all seemed to either be closed down, obviously from lack of travelers, or in too much of a state of disrepair to even be safe stepping inside. You know it's not that simple, Fu. Killing him will not make this country's problems just vanish. Disasters don't die with the person who caused them. Fu huffed as she crossed her arms over her chest, putting more emotion into the gesture than he had seen from her for a long time. It solved Mizuno Kuni's problems. Naruto just frowned as they continued to walk. He looked around at the street they were on, trying to imagine how it must have looked in the days before Gato. He could see the faint images of men and women hurrying about with business while children laughed and played in the streets. Now it was simply barren and empty. And in Mizuno Kuni there was an entire army of rebels ready to come in and fill the void left by Yagura's death. That doesn't exist here. He stopped gesturing around to the empty street, the houses all having their blinds drawn and doors locked. Look around, Fu. You heard what Isaki-san said. These people have lost their hope, their spirit. Unlike Kiri, they don't have the will to fight back. He shook his head sadly. With them like this, killing Gato would only ensure the country a slow death with nobody there to take his place and actually be a true leader to them. Fu frowned at that but couldn't find it in her to argue with Naruto. He often spoke with such conviction it was hard not to believe what he was saying. Are you saying there is nothing we can do? The serious look abated from Naruto's face as his gaze turned warm, a soft smile filling the space on his features. Of course not, I'm just saying we cannot act brashly about this. For now, we simply do what we can to help the people, like you must treat the symptoms of a disease to better understand it. Fu looked at him for a few silent moments before nodding firmly. When he spoke that way, she could almost see the determination rolling off of him in waves. All right. Naruto just smiled at the girl as he put his hand, giving her a moment before she tentatively accepted it. Touching other people in such a non-violent manner was still rather strange for her, even after all this time. Good, now let's find somewhere to sleep. Fu just gave another small nod, a little smile of her own playing about her features as she gazed at her hand, held firmly within his. Luckily for them, Naruto managed to find a small temple on the outskirts of one of the smaller, coastal villages on the island. The elderly monk that lived there was surprisingly hesitant to allow them to stay, but once Naruto made it clear all they needed was a place to rest at night, he was much more hospitable. It saddened the young blonde to think that even one of his fellow monks had been hit so hard by the recent bad times that had descended on Nami no Kuni. He blinked his bleary eyes open, sighing as he looked out at the morning sunlight streaming in through the bare and disused blinds. They were sleeping in the currently unused dojo of the temple that had been covered in dust and cobwebs that they had to clean up before sleeping. Apparently, the old monk that lived here only had enough money to keep a single room clean, the one he stayed in and meditated in. Naruto didn't mind too much. It wasn't much to ask of them for a place to stay over the night. As much as he liked sleeping under the stars, he would always prefer to sleep indoors. Good morning, Naruto. He sighed as he turned on his side, only then noticing the warmth that hadn't been there when he fell asleep. Sure enough, he found himself staring into Fu's sleepy orange eyes as they stared back at him, unabashed. A year ago, he might have jumped away, spluttering and blushing for reasons he couldn't comprehend. Now he was just used to it. He had hoped Fu would grow out of crawling into his bed at night, but unfortunately, she hadn't, so he had just come to accept it. It wasn't like it was unpleasant, just strange. Good morning, Fu. He turned away, sitting up and stretching out his back with a few satisfying pops as a reward. Fu quickly did the same before standing up, Naruto naturally turning away out of politeness. Fu didn't tend to wear all that much when she slept, at least when she remembered to wear anything at all. Naruto had tried to correct her on this, but honestly, he thought she simply ignored him, always stating it was much more comfortable her way. Any further protests he might have had were silenced when she told him to try it before he judged, that tended to quieten him down. Instead, he pulled on his own clothes quickly, running a hand through his hair, if only to check that it was still just as messy as always. He wasn't disappointed. Quickly he tied his hair back into his loose ponytail before putting in his earring, always right by his side when he woke up. He smiled as he just breathed in for a moment, enjoying the peaceful serenity of the morning as he walked over to open up the sliding door that led outside. That peace lasted all of a few seconds as he opened it, only to find himself facing a veritable crowd of people all staring at him. There was a moment of tense silence before. That's him. Please, can you help me? My father is sick. Did you really heal Asaki-san? My little baby Mata, please save her. Naruto just stared wide-eyed at the throng of people all shouting at him, various pleas for aid and healing becoming nothing more than a jumble of words as each person clamored over the other. He gulped as he raised his hands, almost instantly bringing silence to the crowd as they all stared at him expectantly. What's going on? There were a few whispers from within the sea of people before an elderly woman, probably in her late 60s with graying hair pulled back into a tight bun, stepped forward. Are you the Naruto who saved the life of Asaki-san without asking for pay? Naruto just blinked a moment as he stared out at the crowd again with their expectant eyes all looking back at him hopefully. Yes. Almost immediately the cries returned as people practically shouted and begged for him to heal either themselves or somebody close to them. Naruto just took it all in with shock before groaning internally. He should have known news would spread on such a small island nation. He slid to the floor with a dejected thud, exhausted and barely able to keep his eyes open. The people had been relentless in their pursuit of his help. He had tried to organize them somewhat to find out what the most pressing issues were, but of course everybody thought their problems worse than everybody else's. In the end he hadn't even managed to get to even a quarter of the people by the end of the day, and knew more would be back by tomorrow. He knew that without Fu's help he probably would be already passed out on the floor by now. He had vast chakra reserves, but having to consistently use small, precise amounts through various medical jutsu over a wide range of problems, both severe and trivial, was taxing on him and strained his coils. Fu wasn't much better than he was. Her hair was a mess and her body glistened with sweat from how hard she had been focusing just to perform the jutsu themselves. Although Naruto had to admit it was good practice, the problems people had been varied and diverse, and it was a good test for his knowledge and skills. Ano, is anybody here? Naruto groaned a little before looking across at Fu. The verdette simply lay there against the wall, snoring cutely in blissful sleep as he head lolled to one side. He pulled himself wearily to his feet before sliding the door open, somewhat surprised by what he saw. It was a young woman, perhaps in her late 20s or early 30s, with long flowing black hair that cascaded down her back. She wore a loose-fitting t-shirt and a long blue skirt and bore a nervous look on her face as she looked down at him. Hello? The woman's eyes widened as she looked down at the small blonde boy before her. He looked positively exhausted. He was hardly the miracle healer that she had pictured. He was barely a few years older than her son, in fact. Are you Naruto-san by any chance? The boy managed a small smile as he ran a hand through his hair, trying and failing to alleviate some of his fatigue. Yes, that's me. How can I help? The woman's eyes widened again as she suddenly seemed very nervous about being there. It's all right, you're tired and I should come back some other time. She almost turned to go, but Naruto managed to stop her by grabbing her hand. It's all right, really. Now what's your problem? The woman looked down at him for a few moments, biting her lip anxiously before sighing with a kindly smile. If it isn't too much trouble, could you perhaps take a look at my son? Naruto gave her an equally warm smile as he ducked inside the temple again, returning with his shikuju in hand. Of course, I am happy to help. The woman's eyes widened again as she got the hint. Ah yes, it's Tsunami. Chapter 43, Flames 3. I really am sorry about keeping you so late, Naruto-san. I know you must be tired after all you've done today. Naruto just smiled back at the woman as they walked through the small village. The fact the sun was only just beginning to descend over the horizon was rather disheartening as it felt much later to the young blonde. It really was taxing to perform so many medical jutsu over an extended period. It was especially bad when most of the time he was simply diagnosing harmless coughs. I've already said it's okay, it's not too late in the day after all. Tsunami simply nodded hurriedly as they continued on in silence. Occasionally they would pass somebody in the street, but they would only hurry past, ignoring Tsunami's polite nod in their direction. Naruto had a small frown playing at his features as they walked. Many of the cases he and Fu had looked at over the day had been malnutrition or diseases associated with certain deficiencies in diet. It really worried him just how poorly these people seemed to be living while nothing was being done to help them, at least as far as he could see. So, Tsunami-san, what is wrong with Inari, was it? The woman nodded again as they turned out of the main street and onto a less used path that was still well trodden. I'm not sure if it is anything serious, but with what I heard about Isaki I felt I had to be sure. He had a fever a few days ago, and has been complaining of stomach aches ever since. Naruto simply nodded at the information, from that he would guess a simple stomach bug, but first observations could be misleading. From the conditions of the island and the state of the people it could be anything from cholera to a rare virus, although it seemed unlikely. I can see you care about him a lot. Tsunami simply smiled softly, her head drooping in slight embarrassment at the direction the conversation had taken. She was unused to having such a mature conversation with somebody so young. Yes, I love my son more than anything. Naruto gained a smile of his own at that as the trees began to thin out, and a small but still cozy house came into view in the dwindling sunlight. What about you, Naruto-san? Do you have anybody like that? Naruto actually looked up at the woman in surprise, but found her to be looking at the house instead, her footsteps subconsciously quickening as she neared her home. There have been a few people very precious to me over my life. His voice still held its warmth, but his tone was more clipped than usual as they neared the house. Tsunami didn't pry any further as she fished about for her keys before letting Naruto into a small but well-furnished living room, at last in comparison to the rest of the village. Please excuse the mess, my father tends to leave things lying about, and I haven't got around to cleaning just yet. Naruto simply waved her off as he stepped over the threshold, his brow immediately rising in surprise as he spotted the numerous bottles scattered about the tables, and even the floor in a few places. From the smell he knew they were sake bottles, and a few only seemed partially emptied, the stains on the carpet showing it wasn't the first time. That's not a problem. Is your father about? Naruto was thinking about having a chat with the man about drinking so excessively with a child in the house that could easily get to the alcohol. No, my father Tazuna left the island yesterday on business. Naruto nodded absently as he continued to look around the small room in interest, waiting for Tsunami to invite him upstairs. Tsunade had always told him to let clients set the pace for things to put them more at ease. Apparently, it was a condition applicable in both the medical and shinobi profession. Tsunami seemed to have forgotten about that though as she stood there, wringing her hands rather nervously, the topic of her father's work obviously making her anxious. I suppose you have heard of Gato by now? Seeing Naruto nod his head once, Tsunami sighed slightly before slowly making her way towards the stairs at a languid, unhurried pace. Well, my father is a bridge builder, one of the best if you were to believe his wild stories. A soft smile briefly graced the woman's face before it was gone, replaced by a saddened expression. He hopes that by building a bridge to the mainland he can get past Gato's naval blockade and finally allow some trade into our nation. Naruto looked up, surprised but in a pleasant way. That seems like an excellent idea.
He sighed to himself happily, somewhat relieved at the news there really were people that maintained their hope here. Yes, however. Naruto groaned internally, there was always a but. Gato knows this and continues to try and make my father's life as difficult as possible. Of course, he cannot bar my father directly as it is a nationally funded project, but that doesn't stop him from sending his thugs to harass the workers and their families.
The woman glanced down again sadly.
Already the majority of them have had to quit in fear of losing what little they have left, although in truth I cannot blame them. Naruto simply nodded neutrally as they crested the staircase, Tsunami immediately making a beeline for the first door to their left. I see, that really is problematic. Tsunami could only hum in agreement as she quietly opened the door, peering in to check on her son before opening it the rest of the way.
Inari-chan, are you up?
Naruto curiously looked around the doorframe, spotting a young boy a few years younger than he was with messy black hair sitting up on a futon.
Mom, who's he?
Naruto just smiled warmly as he stepped into the room, doing his best to exude a non-hostile air about him in order not to frighten the boy.
Hi Inari, your mother told me you were having stomach aches.
The young boy simply looked up at the blonde suspiciously before his gaze drifted to Tsunami curiously. She was very worried about you and asked me to help, so I'm here to do what I can.
Inari once again looked at Naruto for a few seconds, crossing his short arms over his chest as his eyes narrowed. What do you know?
You're not that much older than me. Naruto just chuckled softly as he walked over, the small comforting smile never leaving his features as he had been taught when dealing with children.
Age can be deceptive, Inari. Did you know most shinobi become genin when they're only 12 years old?
From behind him Tsunami blinked in surprise at that, even she hadn't known that as the inner workings of hidden villages were guarded secrets from anybody, but potential clients. She was trying to imagine her own son becoming a cold-blooded killer, trained in stealth and assassination at such a young age, and she frowned at the appalling idea.
Really?
A sudden look of interest had entered the boy's eyes as he thought about all the cool stories and tales he had heard about shinobi growing up.
Yeah, some are even younger than that.
Inari sat up straighter, his attention now fully on Naruto, as he was speaking though Naruto had already lit his hand up in a dim green glow and was slowly moving it back and forth just above the boy's chest.
No way. Naruto just chuckled lightly as the boy looked up at him with wide, enraptured eyes.
Yes way, back during the Third Shinobi War there were even jounin as young as 9 years old. Naruto added an exaggerated wave of his free hand to add to the atmosphere, as he continued to discern the readings from his mystic palm technique. However, Inari immediately gained that cute confused expression that only young children could have where Naruto could almost see the little cog spinning behind his furrowed eyes.
What was the Third Shinobi War?
Naruto just grinned as he leaned in a little closer, his voice becoming a hushed whisper as Inari instinctively leaned forward himself, allowing Naruto to run his other hand along the boy's back quietly. Just between you and me, there was an entire war fought between ninja around 20 years ago that they never revealed to the public. Inari's eyes widened in surprise at that. He had never heard of a first shinobi war, never mind a third one. Every nation was a part of it, even Hai no Kuni, but because they were ninja nobody ever knew it was happening.
Ninja prefer it when no one knows anything about them.
From the doorways Tsunami smiled lightly. The great shinobi wars weren't exactly a secret, it's just they were rarely spoken about for civilians either due to lack of involvement or the bad memories that came with such days. Naruto was just being more fantastical than necessary, although it warmed her heart to see Inari grinning like that.
How do I know you're telling the truth?
Naruto just leaned back and shrugged casually, the lilting smile on his face not disappearing for a moment. His eyes drifted for a second as his technique dissipated, but Inari couldn't tell due to the way they were squinted.
I guess you can't.
He suddenly leaned in closer again, his voice going back down to a conspiratorial hush as he put a hand up to block his mouth as if people might be listening in. But then you're doing exactly what they want you to do. He leaned back out, looking completely nonchalant as he casually rolled his shoulders and let out a small cough.
But like I said, keep that between me and you. Inari managed to break out of his wide-eyed stupor long enough to nod hurriedly before staring at the wall again, his childish mind no doubt running through a variety of outlandish ideas involving ninja and secret wars. Well, that wasn't so bad, was it? Inari looked around again, that childish confusion of his marring his face again as he looked down at his body. The boy hadn't noticed Naruto do anything other than talk. "Huh, what are you talking about?" Naruto simply grinned as he stood up, dusting off his robes slightly as he took his shikuju from where it had been resting against the bed. "What have we talked about, Inari? Even us kids can have cool techniques, right?" To emphasize his point, his hand suddenly lit up in dull green flames as he waved to the boy, leaving him in a stunned silence as he walked out of the room. Tsunami gave her stunned boy a small wave and a kind smile before gently closing door behind her as she also left, turning to face Naruto, bearing a smile that he mirrored. "You know I haven't seen Inari smile like that for some time now, thank you for that." Naruto just nodded curtly. He could see the boy had a few trust issues from how hostile he was at first, but like he thought Inari was still a child at heart, and it just needed a little coaxing to see that. "It's no problem. I'm sure whatever problems he has, it will only take time for him to work through them at his own pace." Tsunami's smile tightened somewhat at that. She could only hope as much considering everything her boy had been through with the loss of his father figure. "Medically though he's fine, just a small cough that will no doubt pass in a few days if not by tomorrow, nothing to worry about I assure you." With that, Tsunami relaxed again. Even she hadn't noticed Naruto's technique at first, he was quite the amazing doctor. "Then thank you for everything." Naruto simply smiled as he leaned against his shikuju. He always enjoyed these moments after the patient of their loved ones found out they were going to be fine. "If that's everything, then I need to get back to my friend. I get the idea that if she wakes up and finds me to be gone, she might do something unexpected." Tsunami followed him to the door, wringing her hands as she walked slightly nervously. Naruto noticed this, but said nothing. It wasn't really his business after all. Finally, when he reached the door, he felt her hand grip his shoulder lightly, so he turned with an expectant look on his face. "I feel terrible having you help me and offering nothing in return. Are you sure there is nothing I can do for you for helping Inari-chan?" Naruto smiled lightly at the affectionate suffix, remembering when the Sandaime Hokage would refer to him in the same way. He almost grimaced when he realized that deep down, despite all the hardship Nami no Kuni was going through, a small part of him was a little jealous of Inari for having the normal life and loving mother he never could. "My master at the temple I lived in during my childhood once told me that a kind deed is one's own reward, and I think I am inclined to agree with him." He chuckled to himself lightly at that, knowing Chikako had probably never adhered to that principle all that much. "Was he the one who taught you those medical techniques?" Naruto nearly burst out laughing at that, but restrained himself to an amused chuckle as he looked off fondly to the side, his eyes glazed slightly. "Oh no, my medical sensei has a very different opinion in that regard. I don't think she has ever done anything without expecting compensation at the end." He returned his gaze back to the woman with a serene smile and inclined his head slightly. "But I'm not her. Thank you for inviting me into your home. I hope Inari gets well quickly." Tsunami seemed to have lost her nervousness by now and managed to return the gesture more confidently. "Really, if there is ever anything you need, be sure to come and see us. I'm sure Inari-chan would be happy to see you again." Naruto simply nodded, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. He had a feeling he would be busy in the coming days. With nothing else left to be said, he simply turned and walked off back to the temple, offering a small wave over his shoulder to the small family home. His sharp eyes didn't miss the small head peeking from the upstairs window. It turned out he would actually visit Tsunami and Inari again, but not for 2 more days. Before that time he and Fu were predictably busy with all the people asking for their help. Thankfully, after the first day the crowd had lessened gratefully and the two weren't quite as overwhelmed. They had also come up with a system similar to triage, marking off the people with the worst problems and dealing with those first. Tsunade had been right. Coming out and actually experiencing life as a medic was excellent training. Practicing on animals and learning from scrolls just couldn't compare to real, first-hand experience. Once, once the initial rush wore off though, and the people with less serious problems realized that there actually were people worse off than they were, they managed to find some free time. Naruto used the opportunity to introduce Fu to Tsunami and Inari. Tsunami and Fu had been pleasant to one another, but all it took was Naruto mentioning Fu was a former shinobi to get Inari to start questioning her relentlessly. It was actually rather amusing to sit there drinking tea as Inari badgered the poor girl about anything and everything that came to mind, often ending everything with an exuberant shout of cool. Of course, at first Fu had been completely out of her element, startled and hesitant to answer the overly energetic child. However, she eventually began to tell Inari a bit about the missions she had been on, thankfully editing them for the boy's innocent ears. Naruto was glad at least that she understood enough to do that. However, as funny as it was at first, it was incredibly heartwarming to see the girl genuinely interacting with people so quickly after meeting them. It gave Naruto hope for her future. It was the duo's 5th day and Nami no Kuni and Fu had been left with Inari, watching over the boy while Tsunami went out to shop while Naruto offered to accompany her. She had been somewhat hesitant at first due to his age, but didn't regret bringing him along. He was far more mature than his age would suggest, and found his conversation surprisingly pleasant. He himself just enjoyed the company. He so rarely got to speak to people other than those he was traveling with at the time, so it was rather refreshing. And every time Chirika-senpai would turn around, Sora would move the stones again. He would look around and stare at them for a few seconds like he was trying to work out if that was how they had been, but we both just kept looking forward. Chikako Shirsho was trying not to laugh in the corner. He could be so childish at times for somebody so old. Tsunami quietly giggled behind her palm as Naruto told her yet another story from his time at the temple. I can tell your memories of the temple were very fond. Naruto simply nodded as they continued down the street, Tsunami carrying a basket slung over one shoulder that had slowly been filling up with food throughout the day. Yes, they were some of the best years of my life. I'll never forget what they did for me. He sighed wistfully for just a moment, allowing himself just a brief moment of melancholy before returning his attention back to the street ahead of them. They had taken a small detour from the main shopping street through a small row of houses, so that Tsunami could visit one of the more out-of-the-way shops she frequented. But I've said plenty about myself. What about you, Tsunami-san? The woman blushed lightly. Despite Naruto merely being a young teenager, it had been a while since somebody had actually asked her about herself. Oh well, I'm sure you dash. Unfortunately, Tsunami was cut off by an indignant shout followed by a young man around her age being thrown from a house in front of them. Both of them paused as they watched the man land on his back, groaning painfully from the impact before looking up just as two much larger and more dangerous-looking men also emerged from the house, not looking all that amused at the situation. You've pissed off Gato for the last time, you piece of crap. Naruto frowned as the man scooted back, narrowly avoiding getting his legs stamped on by the second burly man. Despite Tsunami's protests, he continued forward, his shikujus jingling, going quiet as he coated the staff with chakra to mask his approach. The three men didn't even realize he was there until he cleared his throat, making the man on the ground whip his head around in fear, while the two thugs simply turned with annoyance. Excuse me. The larger of the two men, the one with the sword strapped to his back in a way that showed he wasn't too experienced with it, grunted down at him. What do you want, you little brat? Can't you see we're busy here dealing with this piece of trash? To emphasize his point, the man's companion delivered a square kick to the grounded man's legs, or would have if he hadn't rolled out of the way with a pathetic whimper. Stop rolling about, you little worm, take your beating like a fucking man. Before the thug could try and injure the man again, Naruto cleared his throat again, causing the first hulk of a man to look around again, this time a more apparent look of annoyance on his weather-hardened features. Right, beat a kid before we have to deal with you like this trash. He put a hand on the hilt of his sword, but Naruto ignored that. The man had pitiful chakra reserves and Naruto could easily block any sloppy blow he would try to make with the weapon. Is there any way I could help here? A look of ugly confusion creased the man's brow as he stared down rather incredulously at the young blonde standing there so defiantly. He was sure the hope and defiance had been beaten out of the nation after Gato had strung up that supposed hero. Ha, unless you got 3,000 Rio kid, then there's fuck all you can do to help this worm. It was the other thug that spoke, looking over his friend's shoulder as he absently continued to try and crush the pleading man's legs. He was wondering why his companion hadn't simply kicked the kid away, or better yet simply killed the little brat. Hope and resistance had to be thoroughly quashed from the people here. Naruto simply stared for a moment before unhooking one of his pouches from his belt. He didn't quite remember how much was in it, but he was sure it was more than 3,000 Rio. Here. He chucked the little pouch to the first thug, who caught it in surprise, the hilt of his sword forgotten as he opened up the little cloth bag. His eyes widened in amazement as glittering money stared back at him, easily over 4,000 or 5,000 Rio. Hibiki, we have the money now, what are we supposed to do? The second thug paused for a moment in confusion. Their orders had been to make an example out of anybody unable to pay the protection fees, which were intentionally too high. He blinked for a moment, his slow brain slowly working behind dull eyes as he peered over at the money in the pouch. Finally, a cruel smile played over his face as he turned back to the man cowering on the ground. Well, isn't it your lucky day, you little bug? Who knew there were people so selfless in the world, eh? Unfortunately, we're still going to have to make an example of you for not being able to pay for yourself. After all, if it can happen once, it can happen again, right? He raised the nasty-looking pole he had in his right hand up, but before it could connect with the other man's head, it met resistance in the form of Naruto's outstretched shikuju. The boy was holding back the full force of the man's blow without any significant effort whatsoever. Is it not enough that you have the money? Will your master not be satisfied with that? If not, then why have you out collecting money at all? What's the point of asking for money if you're determined to beat up people whether or not you get it? Again, it took the brute of a man a few moments to think through Naruto's words before a look of pure irritation overrode any thinking he might have gotten done. Get out of my way, kid, or you'll be next. He seemed blissfully ignorant of the fact Naruto was still effortlessly holding back his pole without even paying attention to what he was doing. The blonde just sighed sadly as he withdrew the staff, leaning on it slightly as the ends of his fingers began to crackle with an almost unnoticeable layer of lightning. I can't let you hurt that man for no reason. No matter how much you may try to justify it, you're doing this merely because you want to, not because you have to, and that cannot be allowed. The man only sneered derisively as he brought his large pole around. It never met its mark though. Before the man could even cry out, he was on the ground twitching, a few stray sparks of electricity arcing across his body as Naruto appeared not to have even moved to those untrained in chakra. The first thug only looked on in shock at his incapacitated companion before looking at Naruto rather fearfully. You should probably get your friend some medical attention quickly. The brute blinked once before nodding dumbly, rushing forward to grab his friend before running off, sending a fearful look over his shoulder at the young blonde. Naruto just stood there and sighed before offering his hand to the man still cowering slightly on the ground, unsure what to make of the situation. Eventually though he took the offered hand, allowing Naruto to haul him off the floor with surprising strength. Thank you, Naruto-san. The blonde blinked in surprise at that. Have we met before? The man just stared at him for a moment before looking at the ground nervously. Naruto could tell he wasn't the type to speak up often. Yes, you helped heal my daughter's broken ankle. Naruto just nodded slowly. He vaguely remembered that, but most of the people he healed all kind of blended into one exhausting blur by the end of the day. Right, well you seem okay, so we'll be going now. The man only just seemed to notice Tsunami standing there, wringing her hands worriedly from behind the young blonde. Wait. Naruto turned curiously to the man again with an eyebrow raised expectantly. He seemed to almost falter at that before gathering himself. Why did you help me like that? Naruto simply smiled happily at the man, seemingly setting him at ease somewhat. I don't really need a reason to help somebody, do I? You should never hurt people without a good reason, but you shouldn't need a good reason to help someone instead, at least I think so. Strangely, the man seemed almost troubled by that as he glanced in the direction the two thugs had gone, his hands twitching lightly by his sides. But now Gato will be angry with you and He looked down ashamedly, sadness crawling across his features like a vulgar insect. And it'll be my fault. He looked up again, that same sickening look of self-pity on his face that almost had Naruto frowning. You've already done so much for our village without asking for anything, so I. His head dropped back down again pathetically. Something told Naruto it had taken a lot for him just to meet his eyes once. I don't really feel worthy of that. Naruto sighed heavily, making the man flinch imperceptibly as he expected some kind of retribution. You don't have to. He was surprised then when Naruto took a step forward, placed a strong hand on the man's shoulder before smiling and turning around, rejoining Tsunami by her side. Now you were about to say something, Tsunami-san? The woman just stared incoherently for a moment before blinking herself out of it and looking down at the boy with uncertainty. Ah, right. She looked back over her shoulder towards the man she knew to be called Itoko. She had met him a few times and had thought he was a nice man, if a little shy at times. Right now, though, he was staring at Naruto's back with something almost akin to awe. She swore she saw a flash of determination and energy flash through him for a moment, but it may have simply been a trick of the light. Well, I suppose I could tell you about Kaiza. Naruto looked up with an interested expression as Tsunami began her story. The rain always made Naruto nostalgic. The gray skies, the light droplets hitting his clothes and forming streams as they gathered atop his Tsujigasa, and the general chill permeating the air. All of it would remind him of Shizuku. Sometimes they would be fond memories, and he would wear a light smile for the rest of the day. Other times he would only see her blood coating his hands, her dying smile as her eyes closed for the last time. Those were the bad days. Luckily, as he strode through the quiet streets of the village, full alongside him, a nostalgic smile tugged at the edge of his mouth. What do you think she would say about all this? Fu looked up with her usual blank expression that made it hard to tell what she was thinking. Normally on days like these, regardless of what emotions it would trigger in Naruto, he would be fairly withdrawn. For him to speak was quite rare. Shizuku? Naruto just nodded as Fu returned to looking in front of her, idly watching the small rivers of water rushing over the brim of her wide hat. She would most likely be complaining about the rain. Naruto chuckled before throwing a more meaningful look her way. He liked that the girl had begun to open up a little more as she spent time around Inari. The young boy had a surprising ability to bring the mint-haired Jinchuriki out of her shell, or more like forced her to. You know what I mean. Fu just nodded, a light smile playing at her own lips. It was a more common occurrence as of late. It was strange because she had thought with all the work they were doing, and the way she always collapsed into bed, exhausted by the end of the day, she would be in a more irritable mood. Instead, she felt fulfilled. It was nice to be doing something she felt was important. She finally had a useful skill that wasn't a means to shorten another human's lifespan, and it was genuinely pleasant. She would be asking us to do everything in our power to help these people, then ignore whatever we would say and go do it anyway. Naruto nodded slowly as they turned a corner onto a familiar beaten track that had become slightly squishier with the rain. Yeah, I thought so. Fu looked around at her first and longest friend, just staring at his far-off look for a moment in silence. Why do you ask? That seemed to bring Naruto out of his thoughts as he looked around, their eyes meeting for a split second before both turned away slightly, rose dusting their cheeks. They were at the stage every person went through when the opposite sex suddenly began to seem more interesting to look at, yet it became inexplicably more embarrassing to do so. I wonder if we're doing enough. Maybe you were right and simply dealing with Gato would be better. At least then the people wouldn't be under his thumb, and could begin to rebuild their lives. Again, Fu simply watched for a moment, weighing her words carefully before doing anything. No, you were right to begin with. Naruto looked around, somewhat surprised by the sudden conviction in the girl's voice. Killing Gato would not achieve anything for these people, at least not yet. With each day I see them starting to talk, whispers are beginning to go around that they needn't be frightened anymore. She smiled lightly as she looked down at her feet, not really paying attention to where she was going. They are beginning to regain their hope.
Naruto sighed in slight relief as he placed a warm hand on his friend's shoulder, not noticing the sudden flush in the girl's cheeks through the rain.
Thanks, Fu. Sometimes you know just what to say.
The girl offered him a small smile that to him was one of the most beautiful sights in the world. The knowledge that somebody precious to him was happy was worth more than anything to him. The two finally reached their destination in the form of Tsunami's house. She had once told him it was technically her father's, but Naruto had never met the elusive bridge builder, so in his mind it belonged to the kindly housewife he had come to know.
Something's off. Naruto frowned as he looked around. Something felt distinctly different about the house.
It didn't take him long to notice it. There were dirty scuff marks on the porch from sandals too big to be Inari or Tsunami. It was strange because the woman normally kept every aspect of her home as clean as possible. He quickly knocked on the door, a little fearful of what might have happened to the people he had come to see as friends. He almost sighed in relief when the door finally opened, however the breath caught in his throat when Tsunami wasn't the one to answer the door.
Can I help you?"
Naruto just blinked at the girl in front of him, long pink hair, a sleeveless red dress, and a shuriken pouch strapped to her thigh. She was a shinobi, but more importantly the forehead protector she wore as a hair band proudly gleamed with the symbol of Konoha. Konoha.
Chapter 44, Flames 4. Hello?
The girl waved a hand in front of his face slowly, a confused expression prevalent on her features as Naruto continued to just stand there dazedly. Suddenly he blinked, snapping out of his semi-trance as his face naturally returned to his usual calm look, almost as if he hadn't just stared dumbly at the girl for a whole 10 seconds without saying anything. To the side, Fu was looking between the two in similar confusion before scrutinizing the pink-haired girl that had opened the door. Like Naruto, she could instantly tell she was a shinobi due to the forehead protector she wore as a hairband. It was that, or some girl had managed to get a hold of one and was wearing it for fun. She didn't seem like a kunoichi. Her legs and arms were skinny and her whole body bore the signs of liveness from diet as opposed to training. Her hair was meticulously clean and shiny, and Fu could smell the strawberry in her shampoo, something that was strange for a kunoichi supposedly out on a mission that shouldn't involve seduction. Fu instantly found that she didn't like this girl all that much, especially after seeing Naruto stare at her like that, although for the life of her she couldn't explain why.
"Oh, I'm sorry about that.
I was slightly surprised that you weren't Tsunami is all." The girl just nodded slowly.
"You are here to see Tsunami-san?" Naruto just nodded quickly, a small disarming smile pulling at the edges of his mouth. "Tsunami-san, there is somebody here to see you."
There was the sound of hurried scuffling from inside the house, and Tsunami quickly made herself known, standing just behind the pink-haired girl.
"Naruto-san, it's good to see you."
Naruto observed the woman carefully. She had told him before that her father had gone to request the help from shinobi, but he couldn't rule out the possibility that she was being held captive. Luckily, she only wore her usual motherly smile, and Naruto let go of any lingering doubts he might have had.
"You too, Tsunami-san. I came by to offer my usual help, but..."
He looked pointedly at the girl still standing to the woman's side. "It seems you have company, so maybe I should come back another dash." Unfortunately for Naruto, any chance of them leaving was dashed as soon as another voice made itself heard.
"Naruto and Aizen. Fu Wenshin."
The blonde monk had to stifle a small sigh of frustration as Inari came barreling out of the house, a small wooden kunai held firmly in his hands. His veritable dive at Fu was instinctually dodged by the verdette, surprising the pink-haired girl with her speed. The poor boy went sailing over the girl, rolling to a messy stop on the ground outside, naturally covering himself in mud. With the energy only children possessed, he jumped to his feet, laughing happily as he waved the toy Fu had fashioned for him about.
"I'll get you next time, Wenshin. Just you wait."
He was soon silenced though as Tsunami quickly clipped him around the back of his head, a scolding expression on her face as she pointed back into the house.
"Inari, what have I told you about attacking Fu-san?
Now get inside and go clean up."
Inari looked rightfully fearful of his mother's suddenly vengeful expression and hurriedly rushed back into the house, dutifully wiping his feet before rushing off upstairs on his little legs. "Ah, I apologize again for him again, Fu-san." The mint-haired Jinchuriki simply waved the woman off. Since she had given Inari the wooden kunai, he had done that to her every time she had come to the house, trying to, in his own words, surpass her with these two arms. Apparently, it was something Kaiza had once told him, and Fu really didn't want to discourage him from trying to become stronger. "It's fine, Tsunami-san." The woman smiled kindly at the younger girl. Like Naruto, it often surprised her how mature and collected Fu could be, and usually was. "Ah, if only everybody was as understanding as you, Fu-san. Anyway, you should probably come and outside from the rain." Naruto actually did sigh that time, quietly though. Now that they had been invited in, there was no chance of them leaving quietly. They were quickly herded into the house after hanging up their hats and cloaks, although Naruto decided to hold onto his shikuju. Soon they found themselves at a table, sitting across from three young shinobi, each regarding them in their own way. First there was the boy with dark hair styled up into spikes at the back in a high-collared blue shirt, white shorts and arm warmers. He sat at the corner of the table, obviously content to just quietly stare at the two rather coldly. Then there was the other boy of their team, with brown shaggy hair hidden by a light gray, fur-lined hoodie that oddly enough had a small white dig sticking out of the front. He had a distinctly feral appearance with his slitted eyes and large triangular red marks on his cheeks resembling fangs. Finally, there was the girl they had met at the door, alternating between staring curiously at them and glancing over to the first boy. "So, who exactly are you anyway?" It was the second boy who asked, the small dog yipping out in what seemed to be agreement with the question. He was quickly hit over the head by the girl of the team, obvious irritation plastered over her face. "Don't be so rude, Kiba Baka." Kiba just snarled at the girl in equal irritation, rubbing the sore spot at the back of his head as the dog in his hoodie growled as menacingly as something smaller than a house cat could. What the hell was that for Sakura? As the two descended into pointless and only half-intelligible squabbling, the final member of their team just calmly sat there, observing Naruto and Fu with scrutinizing eyes. "The mutt raises a good point. Who are you two?" Naruto simply returned the cold expression with a warm smile that was slightly strained at this point. He had met more than a few shinobi in his travels, but he had never met a team so strange, and that was out of experience with people like Omoi and Karui. "Onaizen and Wunchin are the best." Naruto had been about to answer, but it seemed Inari, now damp from a bath with a towel slung over his head, saw fit to answer for them. All three shinobi turned to look at the boy. Kiba and Sakura even stopped fighting to watch the boy run into the room happily, quickly taking a spot sitting on Fu's lap, much to the girl's hidden chagrin. Naruto is a super cool monk that can heal anything, and his eyes are awesome, and Fu is the coolest ninja ever. At the mention of Fu being a ninja, suddenly all attention was on her. Naruto was just glad nobody seemed to have noticed the comment about his eyes. He regretted showing Inari now. "You're a kunoichi?" It was the as of yet unnamed shinobi in the team that spoke, staring at Fu with a gaze so strong it felt like he was trying to see through her. His eyes quickly roamed over her body, taking in the toned muscles of her arms and legs in a manner that distinctly made Fu feel uncomfortable. "What village are you from?" Before the conversation could escalate, Naruto quickly coughed into his hand, drawing attention away from Fu for the moment. "So, you are the shinobi Tazuna-san hired to help defend his bridge?" The dark-haired boy's gaze lingered on Fu for a moment longer before turning to look at the blonde. "Yes, what of it?" Naruto simply shrugged, that calm smile never leaving his features. "No reason, I was simply wondering where the fourth member of your team was. As I understand it, shinobi work in groups of 4 with 3 genin and a jounin sensei, correct?" The boy's eyes narrowed even further at that. "How do you know that?" Naruto's head tilted slightly to the side, his eyes crinkling up into little crescents that reminded the 3 genin eerily of their sensei. "I travel a lot." That didn't seem to particularly sate the dark-haired boy, but by that point the other two had retaken their seats. "Traveled where?" Naruto turned to the Kiba, who had asked the question, and simply looked at him for a moment. carefully weighing what to say much like Fu normally did. Kiba took his silence to mean something else as he grinned sheepishly, rubbing the back of his head. "Alright, I'm Kiba by the way. The pink banshee there is Sakura and the brooding wonder on my other side is Sasuke." Naruto never got to find out what he would say next as he was swiftly silenced by Sakura's fist again, leading the two into another round of pointless bickering that had Sasuke sighing in annoyance to one side. "For your information, our sensei was injured on the way here by a missing nin by the name of Zabuza Momochi." Naruto's eyes widened at that imperceptibly. During his time with the rebellion he had heard a lot about the seven swordsmen of the mist, Zabuza especially. Apparently before the rebellion had even begun, he had tried to lead a one-man coup against Yugura, only to be swiftly defeated before turning tail and running. Mei had been trying to find him for a long time before Naruto, Fu, and Shizuku even entered the country. The swordsmen were all highly skilled, and he would have been an invaluable asset. "Injured? Maybe I could help." Sasuke huffed slightly as his scrutinizing gaze turned on Naruto, as if he was looking for anything special. "And what could you do?" Naruto just offered another disarming smile as he stood up, his hand glowing green with chakra for a moment, much to Sasuke's sudden interest. "I'm trained in medical ninjutsu." Sakura especially seemed impressed by the faint fiery glow around the blonde's hand. She had read about medical ninjutsu, and knew it required the utmost control of one's chakra. To think that somebody who looked the same age as them could have already mastered it to such a degree was incredible. A few minutes later and the three genin were crowded around the door frame to one of the upstairs rooms as Naruto did a checkup on their masked sensei. It wasn't a very long procedure. Naruto simply passed his glowing hand along the jounin's body a few times, a look of intense focus on his face. A look of particular interest crossed his features when his hand passed over the man's covered left eye, but other than that it was simply a routine diagnosis. He stood up, turning to find two expectant and one unconcerned face staring at him. Even Inari had come up to watch. "Your sensei is fine, just a simple case of chakra exhaustion. From the strain on his coils I would say he will be back to full strength in around 5 days. When he wakes up simply tell him to take it easy for a while so he doesn't add any lasting damage on top of what he's already done." He was looking at Sakura as he spoke, so the girl quickly nodded. When Naruto was in what Fu thought of as his doctor mode, his voice carried a surprising amount of authority. "Is there anything you can do to speed it up?" Naruto observed Kiba for a moment before smiling casually. "Of course, there is. However, like anything in medicine, there are inherent risks, especially when dealing with something as delicate as the chakra pathways. There are a few herbal remedies that encourage the production of chakra in your coils, as well as those soldier pills you shinobi are so fond of using. However, such things can also damage your body if taken carelessly, so it is simply better to allow the chakra system to heal in its own time. Besides, it's not like you're in any rush, right? You three are shinobi, so you should be enough to defend the bridge, right?" From the side, Sasuke simply huffed contemptuously at the insinuation he needed their sensei for something as simple as that. "Of course." Naruto just smiled pleasantly as he moved between them and out into the hallway where Fu had been waiting in case he needed help in diagnosis. "Then there's no problem, right?" None of the genin had an answer for him. Luckily the silence was broken by Inari, who throughout the short conversation had been glancing around at all the people there. "Ah, this is boring, Nizan. It stopped raining outside, so come play ninja with me." Naruto chuckled lightly as he ruffled Inari's hair, much to the boy's obvious displeasure. "Yeah, sure." Inari beamed at that, turning to where Fu had been subtly trying to escape, knowing what came next. "Nei-chan, come too." The girl froze before sighing defeatedly, opting to simply follow Naruto and Inari out of the house, leaving three somewhat confused genin behind. Finally, Kiba looked up from where he had been staring after them. This whole time he had been somewhat unnerved by the new arrivals. Growing up in a family that took after dogs so much, he had an inherent sense for particular alphas, even through his boasting that he was one himself. Naruto exuded the same aura his mother did, one of pure power. However, where his mother was wild and unashamed of this, Naruto was very calm and collected. I don't know about you two, but I gotta see this. Without waiting for a reply from his teammates, he took off. Remember to have a strong grip on the handle, you don't want it slipping out of your hands. Inari nodded happily as Fu placed a real kunai in his hands. It was her dullest one, but the boy could still injure himself with it if he wasn't careful. It had taken a lot of puppy dog eyes from Inari for Tsunami to even agree to that much, but Fu preferred it this way. She could technically humor the boy and simply make him go through the motions with the wooden toy she had given him, but she always felt practicing without the proper equipment was pointless. Right, Fu-sensei? The girl sighed lightly before pushing the boy forward slightly, prompting him to get into the position she had shown him. It was a little sloppy, but Fu carefully corrected his posture until it was acceptable before slipping into the same stance. Only hers was perfect. Now follow my movements, move through it slowly like I have shown you before doing it faster. It is always better to know your own movements perfectly than try to go fast and lose yourself. Inari nodded again, his face twisting into a cute look of concentration with his tongue sticking out the corner of his mouth. Slowly the two began to move through a kata of Fu's taijutsu style. Inari followed as best he could, but his young and untrained muscles just couldn't hold some of the more balanced positions Fu's lithe and more suited body could. Does this look like playing ninja to you guys? From the side the three genin sat watching, Kiba and Sakura on the floor, and Sasuke up on a branch of a tree. Kiba was watching on curiously and laughing occasionally when Inari couldn't quite perform one of the movements while Sakura simply seemed confused. It just looks like training to me. The girl wore a look of slight disgust at the thought. Training only got her body all sweaty, and she would never allow herself to look that way in front of Sasuke. Although she had to admit the girl in front of her was very beautiful with her toned yet sleek muscles. She looked down at her own comparatively skinny arms and legs and frowned before looking up at Sasuke in the tree. The dark-haired boy was watching Fu with an unflinching gaze. Despite her movements being overly slow, she performed them perfectly. He had never seen an actual kunoichi in action before. The only thing he had to compare them to were the, in his opinion, weak girls in his own class. Hey Sasuke-kun, what dash? Sakura found herself ignored as the boy she was trying to talk to jumped out of the tree and walked towards Fu and Inari. Hey, you seem fairly strong. His face remained neutral as he stood there, slowly growing annoyed as Fu seemed to ignore him, opting instead to gracefully complete the movement set before turning around, her face a blank mask. How about a spar? Fu just looked at him for a moment as Inari excitedly buzzed by her side. The prospect of seeing two ninja actually fight a little too much for his childish imagination. From the side Sakura frowned. Sasuke had never asked her to spar before. In fact, he never really showed interest in anybody like this. Very well. At this point even Naruto, who had been sitting off to the other side of the clearing in meditation, seemed interested. Sasuke just nodded, walking back a few paces before settling into his taijutsu stance. Fu immediately noted that it was perfectly executed, obviously well practiced. However, whether or not he could maintain that discipline in a fight remained to be seen. She too settled back into her stance, calming her breathing until it was as level as her heartbeat. She never wasted the opportunity to prepare herself when it was presented. The fight was sudden, swift and brutal. Sasuke charged forward, intent on getting the first blow at. However, Fu's eyes snapped open, immediately gauging everything she needed to know. The boy was fast, surprisingly so, and his movements were economic. However, in comparison to Naruto, or the jounin she had fought in Mizu no Kuni, he was fairly average. It didn't take much for her to swat his punch away, shifting her foot back to avoid a sweeping kick before brutally slamming both of her fists into the boy's chest before he could even widen his eyes in surprise. Her movements were fast and efficient, not a single twitch of her muscles was wasted energy. It was a habit bred from fighting in a war. There was no place for flashy moves or exuberant fighting styles. She lacked Naruto's ability to switch interchangeably between large-scale suppression techniques and overbearingly powerful, but directed attacks. She had to make do with her speed and normal jutsu, meaning she had to finish her opponent as fast as possible so she could move on and help her comrades. Sasuke learned that the hard way as he felt the air leaving his lungs.
his body flying back from the blow to land heavily on the ground.
For a moment he just lay there, dazed and shocked. He had never been defeated before, discounting his brother, Kakashi or Zabuza, which he attributed to their age and experience. However, this girl, who was around the same age as him, had disabled him as easily as one might deal with an errant insect. Suddenly, and inexplicably, a small grin formed on his face as he picked himself up off the ground. Absently he heard Sakura calling out to him in worry from the edge of the clearing, but completely ignored it in favor of looking at Fo. "You are fast." The girl had not moved from her stance, ready in case Sasuke decided he wasn't done yet. Her face remained emotionless as she had been trained to do in a fight, and her eyes glanced around for any sign of a trap. "You are quite fast as well." The other two Konoha genin were suddenly shocked as the smallest of chuckles escaped Sasuke's lips. They had never even seen him smile before, never mind laugh. The last time he had been called quite fast was during the bell test, and that was from a jounin. To hear the same thing from this girl his age, without a hint of condescension, was odd. "Right, but don't think I'm finished yet." Fo simply shrugged as Sasuke charged her again. Around 10 minutes later and Sasuke was panting on the floor, various bruises covering his body, but a satisfied smirk on his face. To his side Fo looked at him curiously. A light sheen of sweat covered her body, but otherwise she seemed unfazed. She somewhat admired Sasuke's tenacity. Despite him not actually being able to land a hit on her, he kept coming anyway. He had almost caught her off guard with the fireball, but then again, he hadn't expected the wall of water she had created either. "You really are strong." Fo regarded him for a moment before offering her hand, which Sasuke ignored in favor of getting to his feet himself. "I have faced many strong opponents." Sasuke nodded as he brushed at his clothes in futility. There was a gleam in his eyes at being able to fight a strong opponent. Kakashi always refused to fight him at full strength for obvious reasons. Fo was different. She didn't hold back on him at all. He could feel it in every blow, every counter, and every dodge. However, the only frustrating thing was it was all reactionary. She never took the offensive, although that was probably better for him. "So who is stronger, you or your friend?" Fo looked down, a small smile threatening to pull at her lips as she remembered all her fights with Naruto. They had all been about as one-sided as the spar she had just enjoyed with Sasuke. "I could never hope to defeat Naruto. He is far beyond my strength." The gleam in Sasuke's eyes was renewed as he turned to where Naruto had been sitting throughout the spar. However, the blonde was conspicuously absent all of a sudden. Sasuke had never even felt him leave. Far from annoying the boy, it left him oddly excited. The knowledge of people so strong his age gave him hope for his goals. He was in such a good mood as he walked back that he didn't even bother telling Sakura off for fawning all over him. Naruto had left sometime around the middle of the spar. He knew Fo would be fine against Sasuke. Having fought against multiple jounin during the Bloodline Rebellion, he felt she could handle one genin in a friendly spar without any trouble. He also didn't want to spend too much time around the Konoha shinobi in case one of them happened to recognize him. He had grown up a lot in the 6 years he had been gone from the village, but his main defining characteristic, his blonde hair, was still prevalent. The only thing he had going for him was the fact that his whisker-like birthmarks had all but disappeared since then. He hadn't even noticed it happening until Tsunade had pointed it out one day. It was a very gradual thing, happening over the course of years. It had shocked and confused him at first, having had them for as long as he could remember, and not quite feeling the same without them. After a lot of arguing, Naruto had finally gotten out of the fox that the marks were a result of prolonged interaction with his chakra. Apparently Kinkaku and Ginkaku had received similar marks from eating the walls of his stomach for 2 weeks. According to the Kyuubi, Naruto had received them due to the nature of the Yondaime seal, leaking the potent chakra into his system almost continuously at low levels. Naruto thought there was more to it than that, but the fox was tight-lipped about anything else. His current theory was that the other bijou he contained had begun to cancel out this effect the fox had on his body with their own chakra, and without any one dominant character from any of them, Naruto's body simply reverted to a blank slate, relatively speaking.
Right now, they were nothing more than wispy lines, barely noticeable unless you looked closely. He figured in a few months they would be gone entirely, and he wasn't sure whether to be saddened or relieved. On one hand he would lose something that made him distinctly him, while on the other hand he would be much harder to recognize. He put that to the back of his mind as he walked, taking in the peaceful atmosphere of the afternoon out in the forest. Everything had a slight glimmer from the recent rain, and the insects still hadn't come out yet, so there was a pleasant silence permeating everything. Eventually he found a dry enough clearing to sit down in, and assumed his usual meditative position. Like usual when he did this, the very first thing he did was to extend his senses through the moisture in the air. After having rained like it was much easier for him, and the picture he got back was a lot crisper. He smiled lightly as he shifted his perspective around, searching for Fo, who he quickly found from her familiar signature. She was still fighting who he presumed to be Sasuke, and the boy's teammates weren't too far away. Inari was also there, no doubt enraptured by the spar that he would probably have difficulty following. Tsunami was in the house while the Jounin sensei of the Konoha team was upstairs, although he now appeared to be awake. Finally, his expression turned thoughtful as he noticed a new signature approaching the clearing he was in. He stayed perfectly still until they were quite close. In fact, he could even feel them through the lingering chakra that had naturally seeped into the ground. You might catch a cold if you stay out here too long. Naruto cracked his eyes open slightly, enough to see the newcomer clearly. It was a girl around his age, perhaps slightly older, with long dark hair forming two sleek bangs framing her rounded face. She had large brown eyes and wore a muted but still attractive pink kimono. In all, she was very cute. He offered her a warm smile as he noticed the basket she was carrying, filled with various herbs she had picked. A smirk might have formed on his face when he recognized the herbs had he been any less disciplined. Thank you for the concern. He intentionally left the statement hanging as the girl nodded with her own faint smile. Haku. Naruto's smile widened slightly as he rolled his neck, giving the impression he had been sitting there for a long time. Naruto Uzumaki, but you needn't be worried about me, really. Haku just nodded once, her eyes drifting about the clearing they were in carefully. I have heard of you. People often talk about you in the village. What are you doing out here, Naruto-san? The blonde shrugged slightly as he looked up at the girl, his own eyes regarding her both curiously and carefully. I guess you could call it a form of training. Haku nodded slowly as her eyes continued to roam their surroundings. Why don't you sit down? It's much more comfortable. Haku smiled softly but shook her head. I'm afraid I would get my kimono wet if I did that. Naruto's smile widened even further as he simply waved her concerns away. That's no trouble. Suddenly Haku felt warmth radiate from the blonde and watched in concealed amazement as a small area around him suddenly began to dry. She could literally watch the water on the grass evaporate in an expanding circle with him at the center. When he was finished, there was a patch of perfectly dry ground in a circle around 3 meters wide. There. He offered her another warm smile that she only just managed to pull herself out of her shock to return. Are you a shinobi? You can use chakra and you wear a headband. Haku's eyes never left him as she gracefully tucked her legs under herself to sit down. Oh no, I'm a monk. The headband was simply a gift from some friends during my travels. His smile stayed pleasant as he continued to observe Haku. Although I suppose I should be asking you the same thing, Eni? It wasn't noticeable to the casual observer, but Naruto could easily see Haku suddenly freeze for a split second before her posture returned to normal. What do you mean? Naruto sighed a little, but his smile never dropped. He sensed nothing hostile from Haku. Well, for one, your chakra reserves are much too large for a civilian and flows far too well for somebody untrained, and two, I can see the slight bulges from where you have Sinbon hidden in your clothing. Haku froze again as her previously warm expression turned much colder and more calculating, suddenly regarding Naruto in a different light. Relax, we have no reason to fight, do we? It took a moment, but Haku finally relaxed, the Sinbon that had dropped into her hands returning up her sleeves.
Why did you allow me to get so close if you knew I was a shinobi?
Naruto just chuckled lightly as he leaned back, breaking his perfect posture for the first time to rest on his hands.
And why shouldn't I? Some of the most interesting people I have ever talked to have been shinobi. Haku just frowned at Naruto's apparent lack of concern for the situation. And what if I had meant you ill intent? Naruto never stopped smiling as he looked away for a moment. Do you?
Haku just frowned again. In truth, she had been sent to see whether or not Naruto was a threat or not. Elimination was up to her.
No.
Naruto's smile grew again as he turned back around to face her.
Then there's no problem, right?
Haku wasn't quite sure what to make of the strange boy in front of her. She had never met anybody like him before.
I suppose not. Naruto simply nodded happily as the two of them lapsed into a slightly awkward silence for a minute. Naruto-san, if I may?
The blonde turned back to Haku from where he had idly been fooling a butterfly with his eyes.
What is your reason to train? Why do you continue to try and grow strong?
The blonde regarded the girl for a few moments without saying anything before blowing out a large breath, an amused chuckle escaping his lips.
Well, that's a hard question to answer, isn't it? I suppose it could be all the times Chirika-senpai slapped me over the back of the head for slacking off, or I guess it could be in order to make Chikako Shirsho proud of me. He sighed loudly as he leaned back, looking up at the cloudy sky, still slightly overcast from the recent rain. But really I do it because I need to get stronger. He looked back down, shocking Haku with the sudden intensity in his expression. Because if I don't, then the people closest to me could get hurt again. There was silence in the clearing again as Haku absorbed the words, taking in Naruto's suddenly saddened demeanor. Something told her that he had lost people close to him before. Then I believe you will become strong. The blonde looked up curiously from behind a veil of his shaggy hair, falling messily over his horned headband. You grow strong to protect your precious people, and I think that is when we become truly strong. When we have reason to win as opposed to simply desire to win. Naruto's sad expression gave way to a small smile as he just looked at Haku for a moment. You speak as if from experience. Is that why you are making a chakra-inducing medicine? Is it for your precious person? Haku smiled at that as her thoughts turned to her master. Yes, it is. Naruto just nodded slowly as he pointed off in a seemingly random direction. Then you'll find some tritus flowers in a clearing about 100 feet that way. Haku blinked in surprise at that before remembering that much of the chatter about Naruto in the village was regarding his skills as a medic. She shouldn't have been surprised he could recognize what she had been going to make from the herbs she already had. She stood up just as gracefully as she had sat down, nodding her thanks quickly. Thank you, I think I should be going now. Naruto just nodded his understanding. Maybe we can speak again. A small smile grew on Haku's lips as she began to walk off in the direction Naruto had pointed out. Perhaps, although I feel I should mention. I'm a boy. As Haku walked off, he waited for the inevitable reaction he got whenever somebody found out his real gender, although it never came. When he looked back, Naruto was simply meditating calmly, a peaceful smile on his face. The boy sighed as he walked off, wondering just who he had been talking to back there. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfictions. Looking forward to having you on board again.